Welcome back, my friend. If this story keeps you company tonight, a like helps more than you'd think. It's how these stories find their way to more people like you. Now let's get into it. Ranger Cardenas still works that same stretch of Border River, carrying her grandmother's old warning with her on every patrol since. Our next story takes us to the Big Island of Hawaii, to a national park built around one of the most active volcanic landscapes on Earth, where a construction crew building a new backcountry trail learned that some of the oldest paths on that island were never actually abandoned, only waiting for someone to walk them again. This story comes from the ranger who grew up knowing exactly what to do if that ever happened, and who never once expected, in all her years of training, to actually need that knowledge on the job. This is Ranger Malia Kahale. My name is Malia Kahale, and I have worked as a ranger in beautiful Hawaii Volcanoes National Park for most of my entire career, on a landscape that is, quite literally, still being created. Lava flows from recent decades sitting alongside forest that stood for centuries, an island still actively deciding in real time what shape parts of itself are going to take. I grew up on this island, in a family that has lived here for many generations, and I want to be upfront that some of what I'm about to share comes from knowledge I was raised with, rather than anything I learned through my professional training. Knowledge I'll share carefully in the parts that are appropriate to share publicly, the same way I'd want anybody outside my own family and community to treat it. I grew up spending a great deal of my childhood at my grandmother's house, a small place not far from the park boundary where she'd lived her entire life, raising 6 children of her own in the same rooms I eventually spent my summers in as a girl. She worked, for most of her adult life, as a school teacher, deeply respected throughout our community for her patience and her genuine warmth, qualities that made the particular firmness in her voice whenever she talked about certain things stand out, all the more sharply by contrast. I want to be honest that I didn't always take everything she told me with equal seriousness as a child, the way most children eventually push back a little against the specific authority of a beloved grandmother's rules. But there were certain instructions she never once allowed room for negotiation on, and the protocol for Hukai Po sat right at the top of that very short list. This park itself presents a particular kind of challenge for exactly the sort of trail construction project I'm about to describe. Terrain that shifts and changes in ways few other national parks ever need to account for. Recent lava flows creating entirely new ground within living memory alongside forest and cultural sites that have stood largely undisturbed for many centuries. Every construction project here has to account not only for the usual engineering challenges any backcountry trail presents, but for an active, living volcanic system that can, without much warning, reshape the very ground a planned route was designed to follow. It's a landscape that demands a particular humility from anyone who works in it professionally. A lesson this island has taught me more than once over the course of my career, in more ways than the one I'm telling you about tonight. I want to tell you about my grandmother first, because she's the reason I handled what happened the way I did, rather than the way my professional training alone might have led me to handle it. She taught me from a young age about Hukai Po, the night marchers, spirits of ancient warriors and chiefs said to walk certain old trails on specific nights, processions that living people are never meant to interrupt or observe directly. The core protection she taught me was simple, consistent, and unwavering, the same core instruction I've since heard described the same way by other families across this island. If you ever find yourself in the path of that procession, you do not look at them directly. You lie face down, you stay silent, and you wait until they've fully passed before you move again. This is the story of a construction crew building a new stretch of backcountry trail, and of the one long, unforgettable night I had to convince an entire work site, including a man who didn't believe a word of what I was telling him, that following that old instruction exactly was the only thing standing between all of us and something none of us wanted to actually find out. The park had contracted an outside construction firm to build an extension of an existing backcountry trail, connecting two sections of the park that had previously required a considerably longer detour to travel between. A project that had been planned and budgeted for years before it finally broke ground. The proposed route would cut across a stretch of terrain that, while not containing any formally registered archaeological sites, sat close enough to several documented culturally significant areas that our standard clearance process treated it without particular care, more thorough than a typical trail project might otherwise receive. Standard park protocol required a cultural resource clearance survey before any ground-disturbing work could begin, a process I was assigned to help coordinate given both my professional role and my own standing within the local community. Walking the proposed route with our cultural resources team to identify and flag anything requiring special consideration before the construction crew ever brought equipment onto the site, checking historical maps and prior survey records against every foot of the proposed route over the course of several long, methodical days in the field. That survey took the better part of a week, careful, methodical work that involved consulting historical records alongside direct field work, checking the proposed route against everything our office had documented about the area's history and significance. That survey cleared without any particular concern, at least not the kind of concern our formal documentation process is equipped to flag, and the crew broke ground on schedule, a team of about a dozen workers, some local hires and some brought-in workers. Some local hires, and some brought in from the mainland by the contracting firm, working under a fairly aggressive timeline the firm's project manager had committed to in the original bid. I want to be honest that our formal clearance process, however careful, is built primarily around documented archaeological and historical evidence, the kind of thing that leaves a physical or written record behind. It isn't designed to capture, and was never intended to capture, the specific, living understanding some roots carry within local families and communities, regardless of what any official survey happens to formally document. Within the first week of construction, individual crew members began reporting something that none of them, at first, connected to any of the others. Distant torchlights moving in a steady, deliberate line along a ridge above the worksite after dark, visible only briefly before disappearing from view, accompanied, more than one worker separately reported, by a low, rhythmic drumming sound carried faintly on the wind. The first report came from a young local hire, working his second season on a construction crew after finishing trade school, who mentioned it almost apologetically to his foreman one morning, clearly embarrassed and expecting to be dismissed or teased, describing the lights carefully and specifically despite his obvious discomfort at bringing it up at all. 2 nights later, one of the mainland hired crew members, a man with no particular connection whatsoever to local culture or folklore, no family history that would have primed him to expect or imagine any such thing, described almost the identical experience to a different colleague entirely, unaware the first worker had reported anything at all, his own account matching the earlier one closely enough in specific detail that his colleague immediately connected the two and brought both accounts to my attention within the same afternoon. By the end of that first week, I'd personally collected 4 separate, independent accounts, each one describing the lights moving at roughly the same pace, along roughly the same stretch of ridge, always sometime between full darkness and midnight. The mood across the work camp shifted noticeably over that same stretch of days, a growing, unspoken tension replacing what had started as a fairly ordinary, business-like project atmosphere, the kind of subtle change in group dynamics that any experienced project supervisor eventually learns to read even without anyone directly naming the cause out loud. Workers began doubling up rather than walking to the latrine or the equipment shed alone after dark, a habit nobody formally organized, but that spread naturally across the entire crew within days of the first report circulating. I noticed, too, a subtle but real drop in the crew's overall efficiency during that period, understandable given how little genuine sleep people get once fear starts eating into the quiet hours they'd normally spend resting. Exhaustion compounding the same unease that was causing it in the first place. Several of the local hires approached me privately, separately from any official report, simply wanting to talk through what they'd heard or experienced with somebody who they trusted to actually understand, rather than dismiss it outright. I want to say plainly that this quiet, private trust, extended to me specifically because of who my family is and where I come from, mattered enormously to how effectively I was eventually able to respond once the situation escalated. People told me things in those private conversations they would never have included in an official incident report to a park ranger they didn't already know and trust on a personal level. I want to emphasize how independently these reports came in. These were people who mostly hadn't worked together before this specific project, sleeping in separate tents scattered across the work camp, and yet the descriptions that reached me over those first several days matched each other with a consistency that immediately caught my attention professionally, well before any personal significance registered. Multiple people, entirely unprompted, independently describing the same specific number of lights, moving at the same steady pace, along the same general stretch of ridge, on different nights spread across that first week. The construction firm's project manager, a man named Craig Palmer, had flown in from the mainland to oversee this project directly, his firm's reputation and his own considerable bonus riding on hitting an aggressive completion date the firm had committed to in their original bid. Craig had built a solid career over nearly 2 decades in remote infrastructure and trail construction projects across several continents, competent and generally well-regarded within his industry for exactly the kind of steady, unflappable project management that made him the natural choice for a job requiring careful coordination between a mainland firm and a genuinely remote work site. A reputation built on precisely the kind of calm, evidence-based decision-making that made his eventual, thoroughly shaken transformation all the more striking to everyone who'd worked alongside him before that particular project. Craig's response to the growing unease among his crew was immediate and entirely dismissive. He treated it, from the very first conversation I had with him about it, as exactly the kind of thing crews sometimes invent when they're tired, overworked, and looking for an excuse to slow down a demanding schedule. A morale problem to be managed, rather than anything requiring genuine investigation. He'd worked remote job sites all over the world, he told me more than once, and he'd heard some version of a spooky story on nearly every single one of them, always coincidentally arriving right around the point in a project when crews started. Grumbling about overtime, a pattern he'd apparently seen play out identically in 3 different countries across his career, which he offered to me as evidence of the phenomenon's universal, entirely human origin, rather than anything specific to this particular island. I want to be fair to Craig, because his skepticism wasn't unreasonable given his own professional experience, and construction crews genuinely do sometimes manufacture exactly the kind of story he suspected this was. What made this situation different, and what I struggled to convey to him in terms that made sense within his own framework, was the specific consistency of the independent accounts, details matching across people who had no clear incentive to coordinate a shared story, and, in several cases, hadn't even spoken to each other about what they'd seen before I interviewed them separately myself. I sat down with Craig directly once the reports had accumulated enough that I felt I owed him a fuller explanation than a simple request to adjust the work schedule, meeting him in the small trailer his firm used as a field office, spread with site maps and a construction schedule marked up with the kind of aggressive red deadline notations that told me exactly how much pressure he was personally carrying. The trailer's small window unit air conditioner rattling steadily in the background. Throughout our entire conversation, I told him about huakai po, being careful, the way I try always to be careful in these conversations, to share only what's appropriate for me to share outside my own family and community. framing it honestly as a real, actively held belief within the local community rather than dressing it up as either quaint folklore or hard scientific fact. I explained that certain old trails across this island, this particular ridge included, are understood to be routes these processions still travel on specific nights, tied to the traditional Hawaiian lunar calendar rather than any Schedule A construction firm's Gantt chart would ever naturally align with, and that the protective response, if you ever found yourself genuinely in their path, was simple, consistent, and non-negotiable. I told him, too, that when I'd first heard the scheduled date for the equipment relocation, I'd immediately checked it against everything my grandmother had ever taught me, about which nights carried particular significance, and that the date fell uncomfortably close to exactly the kind of night she'd always warned me to treat with the greatest caution. A detail I shared with Craig directly, hoping the specificity of that timing might carry more weight with him than the general warning alone had managed to. You do not look at them. You get low, face down, and you wait, silent and still, until it's over. I told him, too, that families across this island have carried some version of this exact instruction for generations, that it wasn't a story unique to my own grandmother or my own family, and that the consistency of that instruction across so many otherwise unconnected households struck me, personally, as its own kind of evidence worth taking seriously, however that evidence might sit alongside his own professional standards for proof. Craig listened politely enough. I'll give him that much credit, taking a few notes in the margin of his site map in a way that struck me, in the moment, as more performative than genuinely absorbed. But I could see, watching his face throughout that entire conversation, that none of it was actually landing as anything beyond an interesting cultural anecdote. Certainly nothing he considered relevant to his own crew's actual physical safety or his project's timeline. He thanked me for the context, told me he respected local traditions, genuinely and sincerely as far as I could tell, and then, within the same conversation, informed me that the crew would be proceeding with a scheduled overnight equipment relocation along that exact ridge trail later that same week, a logistical necessity, he explained, given how the rest of the project's timeline had been sequenced, the specific date already locked into a broader schedule that involved coordinating heavy equipment deliveries he wasn't prepared to reshuffle on what he clearly still considered insufficient grounds. Before that scheduled night arrived, 2 of the crew members, walking the ridge in daylight to scout the equipment relocation route, found something that finally shifted at least a few people beyond simple second-hand reports. A section of bare volcanic rock along the trail showed unusual scorch marks, dark and precise in a way that didn't match any natural burn pattern either of them had seen before on that kind of terrain, arranged in a loose line that roughly matched the direction the torchlights had reportedly moved, each mark roughly evenly spaced from the next in a pattern too regular to easily attribute to random natural scorching from any process either of them could readily name. Nearby, in a patch of ash-softened ground, they found a scattering of bare footprints, unusually large, with a stride pattern longer and more evenly spaced than anything either of them associated with normal human walking. The prints themselves oddly shallow given their size, as though whatever made them carried considerably less weight than a footprint that large would normally suggest. One of the 2 workers, a long-time local hire with considerable field experience, reading terrain and animal sign from years of hunting trips across this same general region, told me afterward that he'd genuinely never seen anything quite like it in Ewan. Decades of working outdoors on this island, careful to note that he wasn't claiming any special expertise beyond ordinary observation, only that the prints simply didn't fit any pattern his own considerable experience could readily explain. They photographed everything carefully and flagged the site, and I arranged for our park's cultural resources team to properly document it the following morning, hoping a formal record might finally give Craig something more concrete to weigh against his own understandable skepticism. something with the kind of physical, photographable substance his professional training was built around trusting. I want to walk you through what happened to that site overnight, because it's the one piece of this account with a clean, ordinary explanation. When our documentation team arrived the next morning, the entire marked area sat under a thin, even layer of fresh volcanic ash. The scorch marks and footprints completely obscured beneath it, indistinguishable from the surrounding undisturbed ground. A minor vent elsewhere in the park had been intermittently active that same week, producing exactly this kind of light ashfall across nearby sections of the park, depending on wind direction, a genuinely ordinary occurrence in a park built around active volcanism, and it had simply settled over that exact site sometime in the night, erasing our one piece of physical evidence before anyone could properly preserve it. I spent the 2 days between that discovery and the scheduled equipment relocation preparing as carefully as I knew how, reviewing everything I could recall my grandmother ever telling me about the specific timing and behavior of these processions. Calling her directly one evening to walk through the details once more, wanting to be as certain as possible that my own memory hadn't softened or altered anything important over the years, since I'd last needed to actually apply it rather than simply carry it as inherited knowledge. I remember sitting on my own back porch during that call, notebook open on my knee, asking her the same handful of questions in slightly different ways to make sure I hadn't misremembered any critical detail. And I remember, too, the particular patience in her voice as she answered each one without ever once making me feel foolish for needing to ask twice. She listened to my account of the torch sightings and the footprints without any surprise at all, confirming gently that everything I was describing matched exactly what she'd always taught me, and reminding me one final time before we hung up that the instruction itself was the only thing that mattered, regardless of how frightened or uncertain I felt in the actual moment. I also spent time, over those same 2 days, quietly preparing a handful of the crew members who'd approached me privately, walking each of them individually through exactly what to do if the worst happened during the scheduled overnight move, wanting at least a core group who understood the protocol clearly enough to help model the correct response for anyone else who might freeze or hesitate in the actual moment. I didn't share this preparation with Craig directly, uncertain how he'd react to learning I was, in his likely view, actively spreading what he still considered an unfounded fear among his crew, and I made the judgment call one I still believe was correct. That quietly ensuring as many people as possible knew what to do mattered more than managing his particular comfort with the situation. I made the decision to be present myself for the scheduled overnight equipment relocation, officially in a ranger liaison capacity. Though I want to be honest that my real motivation was considerably more personal, an intention to be there in case the crew needed somebody who genuinely understood what they might be dealing with. Craig didn't object to my presence, treating it, I think, as a reasonable Park Service formality rather than anything he considered urgently necessary, and I spent the drive out to the site that evening running through, almost obsessively, everything running through. My grandmother had ever taught me about that protocol, wanting to be absolutely certain I could deliver clear, immediate instructions to an entire unfamiliar crew, if it actually came to that. My hands tight on the steering wheel the whole way out, rehearsing the exact wording I intended to use if the moment actually arrived. The crew began their equipment move a little after the sun went down, working methodically along the ridge trail with headlamps and a small convoy of utility vehicles, the mood tense but businesslike, several workers glancing repeatedly toward the darker stretches of the ridge above them, without ever quite admitting out loud what they were watching for. I stayed close to the group rather than hanging back in an official observer capacity, watching the terrain and the darkening sky with an attention that had nothing to do with my usual patrol habits. I felt it before I heard anything definite myself, a specific, prickling awareness that settled over the whole group almost simultaneously. Conversation dying away on its own without anyone calling for quiet, the ordinary night sounds of insects and wind seeming to thin out around us in a way that reminded me though I didn't make the connection consciously until later, of exactly the kind of unnatural, quiet other rangers from other regions have described to me over the years from their own. Strange nights in the field, a specific stillness I've since come to recognize as its own kind of warning. Then the drumming started, low and rhythmic, considerably closer than any of the previous second-hand reports had described it, carrying across the ridge with a physical presence that felt less like sound arriving from a distance and more likely something already settling directly into my own chest. Moments later, the lights appeared. A steady line of torches moving along the ridge above us with a deliberate, unhurried pace that had nothing accidental or natural about it at all. Each flame holding a steady, warm glow entirely unlike the flickering, wind-affected movement any ordinary fire would show in that same open terrain. I gave the order immediately, my voice carrying with a command authority I don't think I'd ever fully used in this job before that exact moment, telling every single person on that work site to get down, face to the ground, eyes closed, and to stay that way no matter what they heard or felt until I told them otherwise. Most of the crew complied instantly, dropping to the ground with the kind of immediate, unquestioning obedience that comes from genuine fear overriding any lingering skepticism, several of them already flat against the dirt before I'd even finished the second sentence of my instruction. Craig didn't move. I want to describe what happened over the following minute as carefully and as honestly as I can, because it's the part of this story I've relived more times than almost anything else in my career. I grabbed Craig's arm, pulling hard enough that I nearly overbalanced both of us, telling him, in the flattest, most urgent voice I could manage, to get down immediately and not to look. He resisted for a moment, still standing. Still, I believe, genuinely convinced this was an elaborate crew prank, or a trick of light and shadow he intended to catch in the act, his head turning deliberately toward the approaching torches despite everything I was telling him, his professional instinct to personally verify and document any problem on his own job site, apparently overriding even his own visibly rising fear in that critical moment. Craig, now, I told him, my voice cracking with an urgency I'd never once heard in my own voice before. And when he still hesitated, still turning toward the ridge, I did something I've never done to another person in this job before or since. I got him down eventually, forcing him flat with more physical effort than I'd ever expected this job to require of me. Pressing his face firmly toward the ground and holding him there while the drumming grew louder, closer. The specific weight of that procession's passing settling over the entire prone, silent crew in a way I still struggle to fully describe in words that do it justice. A pressure that felt less like sound and more like something vast and deliberate moving directly overhead. Close enough that I swore I could feel displaced air against the back of my own neck, despite my face pressed flat against the cooling volcanic rock. I don't know how long we stayed like that, faces down, silent, the drumming rising to something almost unbearably close before beginning, gradually, to recede again, moving on along whatever path it had always been traveling long before any of us built a trail anywhere near it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I kept one hand pressed firmly against Craig's shoulder the entire time, unwilling to risk him lifting his head even a fraction until I was completely certain it had fully passed. When I finally judged it safe enough to tell everyone to get up, the ridge above us sat dark and ordinary again. Nothing visible at all except stars and the shapes of familiar terrain. I want to describe the crew's reaction in that first minute after standing, because it stayed with me almost as vividly as the procession itself. Nobody spoke at first, several people simply standing in place, breathing hard, one of the younger workers openly crying without any apparent embarrassment about it. An older crew member reaching out to steady him with a hand on his shoulder without either of them needing to exchange a single word. There was a particular shared quality to that silence, the specific bond that forms almost instantly between people who've just survived something together that none of them will ever be able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. Several crew members came to me individually over the following days, once the immediate shock had settled into something more manageable, thanking me specifically for the private preparation I'd given them beforehand, telling me that knowing clearly what to do the moment I gave the order had made an enormous difference in how quickly they were able to comply without hesitation. I've carried that feedback with me since, a reminder of how much difference calm, clear preparation can make in a genuine crisis, regardless of whether that crisis fits neatly into any category a standard emergency training program would typically cover. What? Craig collapsed less than a minute after standing back up, dropping suddenly to his knees, and then fully to the ground, unresponsive, his breathing shallow and irregular in a way that sent the entire crew into immediate, practiced emergency response. Several of them trained in basic first aid from standard job site requirements, one worker already radioing for emergency evacuation before I'd even fully processed what was happening in front of me, another kneeling immediately beside Craig, checking his pulse and airway with the calm, methodical competence of somebody who'd clearly drilled this exact scenario more than once in prior job site training. We had him stabilized and on a medevac helicopter within the hour, working under headlamps and the kind of controlled urgency that comes from people genuinely knowing what they're supposed to do in a crisis even while their hands are shaking. The whole crew standing in a tense, silent cluster watching the helicopter's lights disappear into the dark toward the nearest hospital, nobody speaking again until the sound of its rotors had faded completely from earshot. He survived, recovering over the following weeks from what doctors eventually described as a severe, acute stress response, with some neurological features they couldn't fully explain through any single, clean diagnosis, ruling out stroke and cardiac event through extensive testing without ever landing on a fully satisfying alternative explanation, running scan after scan, that consistently came back showing nothing definitively wrong, even as his own initial symptoms had genuinely alarmed the emergency medical team that first treated him, one attending physician later telling me, off the record, that she'd rarely seen a patient present with symptoms that serious and then simply stabilize without any clear underlying cause her team could ever confidently identify. He remained hospitalized for the better part of 2 weeks, considerably longer than his medical team initially expected, given how quickly his other vital signs stabilized, before finally being released to continue his recovery at home on the mainland, discharged with a diagnosis vague enough, by his own later account, that he'd stop bothering to explain it in detail to anyone who asked. I visited him once before he flew home, driving nearly 2 hours each way to the hospital where he'd been transferred for his final week of observation. And I want to describe that conversation carefully, because it's the moment this whole account shifted, for me, from a strange professional incident into something considerably more personal. Craig was pale, still visibly shaken in a way that had nothing to do with his physical recovery alone, propped up in a hospital bed considerably diminished from the confident, businesslike figure I'd first met weeks earlier at that construction site. Trailer. He told me in a quiet, careful voice entirely unlike the confident, businesslike tone I'd grown used to over the preceding weeks, that he remembered looking just for a fraction of a second before I forced him down, and that whatever he saw in that fraction of a second was something he wasn't ready to describe to anyone, possibly ever, and that he understood now, completely and without any remaining trace of his earlier skepticism, exactly why the instruction had been so absolute. I didn't push him for more detail. I understood, sitting there beside his hospital bed, that whatever he'd glimpsed belonged entirely to him now. In the same private, unshareable way, certain things eventually belong to anyone who lives through them directly, rather than hearing about them secondhand. He thanked me, more than once during that visit, for physically forcing him down despite his own resistance, telling me plainly that he believed, without any real doubt in his own mind, that I'd genuinely saved his life in that moment, whatever exactly that fraction of a second had cost him regardless. I told him honestly that I was simply grateful I'd been strong enough in that specific moment to actually manage it, that another few seconds of hesitation on my own part could easily have meant a very different outcome for both of us. The construction firm formally revised its own site protocols following that incident, incorporating cultural resource guidance directly into project planning for any future work in areas with documented cultural significance. A change that came, I want to be honest, considerably later than it should have, but that has since become standard practice across every subsequent project that firm has taken on anywhere in this state. I was invited some months later to consult on exactly what that revised protocol should actually include, an invitation I accepted carefully, working with the firm's leadership to build something that treated local cultural knowledge as a genuine, practical safety input rather than a box to check for public relations purposes. A project that ultimately took the better part of a year to develop properly, and that I remain genuinely proud of, regardless of the difficult circumstances that first made it necessary. Craig himself, once he'd finally recovered enough to return fully to work, requested reassignment away from any future Hawaii projects entirely, a request the firm honored without question or explanation required. I understand from a colleague who stayed in occasional regular contact with him that he still works in remote infrastructure projects, though considerably more cautious now, by all accounts, about dismissing local warnings on any subsequent job site, wherever in the world that particular job site happens to be located. I still work this same park, and the trail that crew eventually finished building, months behind its original schedule but completed with considerably more care and respect than it began with, now carries hikers along the same ridge where that procession passed through us that night. I make a point, whenever I brief new construction crews or research teams working anywhere near documented culturally significant routes, of sharing exactly what my grandmother shared with me, framed carefully and respectfully, not as a colorful local legend but as a genuine practical safety instruction that has, at least once in my own direct experience, made the difference between an uneventful night and something considerably worse. I think often about that fraction of a second Craig described, the thing he saw and has never fully told me about, and about the particular weight of watching somebody's entire framework for understanding the world shift, permanently and invisibly, the space of a single night. I don't know exactly what he saw, and I don't expect I ever truly will. I only know that my grandmother's old instruction, followed completely and without exception by everyone who trusted it that night, kept an entire work crew safe on a ridge that has clearly never stopped belonging, at least on certain nights, to those who walked it first. I've thought a great deal, in the years since, about the particular position I occupy in this job, standing somewhere between my own family's inherited knowledge and the modern institutional framework I work within professionally, translating between the two whenever a situation genuinely requires it in a way my formal training alone never fully prepared me for. It's not always a comfortable position to hold. There's a real risk, every time I share something like this professionally, of having it dismissed as exactly the kind of quaint local color Craig initially took it for, or, just as uncomfortably, of having it treated with a kind of performative respect that doesn't actually translate into genuine operational caution when it matters most. What happened on that ridge convinced me, more thoroughly than any single experience before it, that the effort is worth making regardless of that discomfort. My grandmother passed away a few years after all of this happened, and I had the chance, before she did, to tell her the full story exactly as I've told it to you tonight. She listened the same patient way she always had throughout her long life, and when I finished, she simply told me she was glad the instruction had done exactly what it was always meant to do, protecting people who trusted it completely, whether or Not they'd ever fully believed in the reasons behind it before that night finally gave them one. Ranger Kahale still briefs every new crew working near culturally significant routes with the same care her own grandmother once used with her. Our next story takes us to the far north of Wisconsin, out onto the frozen waters of Lake Superior around the Apostle Islands, where old station logbooks kept a quiet, unofficial record of something no formal incident report ever fully explained. This story comes from the ranger who was nearly the one to erase that record for good, before it ended up saving somebody's life. This is Ranger Eric Halvorsen. My name is Eric Halvorsen, and I have proudly worked as a ranger at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore for most of my entire career. A park built around 21 separate islands scattered across a stretch of Lake Superior, a lake large and cold, enough that it behaves in a lot of important ways, more like an inland sea than anything most people picture when they hear the word lake. Winter here is its own particular season of work. The islands closed to regular visitor access, ferry service suspended entirely for the season, the ice itself becoming, depending on conditions, either the only way to reach certain areas at all or the single most dangerous hazard in the entire park. Dimewall. My own family has fished and worked these waters for 4 full generations, going back to my great-grandfather, who came over from Norway specifically because this lake reminded him enough of home that he never seriously considered settling anywhere else once he arrived. I grew up in a small town not far from the mainland side of the park, in a household where my grandfather still occasionally took my father and me out ice fishing in the winter, teaching us to read ice conditions with the same careful, practiced eye he'd learned from his own father decades earlier. That upbringing shaped how I eventually approached this job more than any single piece of formal training ever did. A deep, inherited respect for exactly how quickly this lake can turn dangerous for anybody who mistakes its stillness for safety. I want to say plainly that I came into this particular winter as somebody who considered myself thoroughly practical about ice, somebody who trusted careful assessment and hard-won experience over anything resembling superstition. I still consider myself that same practical person today. I simply also carry, since that particular winter, one additional piece of practical knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into any category my earlier training would have recognized. I wanted to describe what those weeks of transcription actually felt like, because the specific, patient nature of that work matters to how I eventually noticed what I noticed. Working through decades of somebody else's handwriting, day after day, creates a strange, one-sided intimacy with people you've never met, and in most cases, will never have the chance to meet, each ranger's particular habits and quirks becoming familiar over enough entries, one man's tendency to note the exact wind direction every single day regardless of relevance, another woman's dry, understated humor occasionally slipping through even the most routine incident description. A third, ranger's habit of ending nearly every entry with a small personal observation about the sunset that had nothing whatsoever to do with official park business. By my 3rd week, I felt in some strange way like I'd come to know several of these long-departed colleagues personally, an intimacy that made the specific consistency of their independent light sightings spread across people who couldn't possibly have influenced each other's accounts given how many decades separated some of them, considerably harder to dismiss than it might have been coming from a stranger's single, isolated report. This is the story of a set of old, faded station logbooks I was assigned to digitize one long, quiet winter, and of a subtle, informal pattern buried inside decades of ordinary handwriting that I very nearly deleted from the official record entirely. Or it ended up being the only reason I found a man who would not otherwise have survived that particular night at all. Every winter, once the park's regular visitor season fully winds down, our staff shifts toward the kind of administrative and maintenance work that never quite fits into the busier months. And that particular winter, our regional supervisor, a man named Paul Sorensen, had launched an ambitious initiative to fully digitize our station's historical records, decades of handwritten logbooks going back to well before any of us currently on staff had been born. Paul had transferred into our region from a much larger park a few years earlier, bringing with him a genuine, well-intentioned commitment to modernizing what he considered an outdated, inconsistent paper record system that made basic research needlessly difficult for staff and researchers alike, arriving with a clear, detailed vision for exactly what a properly organized, searchable park archive should look like based on systems he'd helped implement successfully at his previous posting. Paul ran our regional office with a genuine competence that most of the staff, myself included, respected considerably, even when we occasionally found his particular brand of process-oriented thoroughness a little exhausting to work under. He wasn't the kind of supervisor who dismissed field staff concerns out of hand, generally taking time to actually listen before making a final call, a quality that made his eventual firm position on the logbook pattern land considerably harder than it might have from somebody I already considered dismissive by temperament. He'd built his own career, prior to arriving at our region, on a reputation for careful, methodical decision-making, the kind of manager who read every relevant report thoroughly before committing to a position, a habit that made his relatively quick initial dismissal of the light pattern all the more notable, since it represented one of the few times I ever saw him reach a firm conclusion without first requesting considerably more supporting data than I had actually managed to provide him. First time, I was assigned to lead that digitization project personally, a task that suited my own detail-oriented temperament well enough, working through box after box of water-stained, sometimes barely legible logbooks in our station's small records room. Transcribing each entry carefully into a new searchable database Paul had commissioned specifically for this purpose. It was slow, methodical work, exactly the kind of task that fills a winter season when the lake itself makes most other outdoor work genuinely dangerous to attempt. Hours spent squinting at faded ink and increasingly familiar handwriting styles from rangers I'd never met, but had come, in a strange way, to feel I understood at least a little by the end of that project. I want to describe Paul fairly, because his motivations throughout this story came from a genuine, if occasionally rigid, professionalism rather than anything careless or dismissive of the work our predecessors had done. A distinction, I think, matters enormously to how anyone listening should understand everything that follows. He simply believed firmly that a modern Park Service record should read like exactly that, a professional, verifiable historical account, free of the kind of personal, unverifiable notation that had crept into those old logs over the decades from rangers who'd clearly used their entries as much for personal reflection as for official documentation. It was somewhere in my third week of transcription, working through logbooks spanning several different decades, and more than a dozen different rangers' individual handwriting, that I began noticing something that took me considerably longer to consciously register than it probably should have. Scattered throughout those old logs, never in any formal incident report format, always tucked into the more casual, personal notes some rangers kept alongside their official entries, were occasional references to a light seen out on the ice at night. The phrasing varied slightly from ranger to ranger and decade to decade, but the core description stayed remarkably consistent. A pale, drifting glow, moving slowly out over open ice or occasionally open water, always at night. Always described with night. The same slightly uneasy, understated tone of somebody noting something they weren't entirely sure how to categorize within an otherwise routine patrol log. I remember one particular entry that stopped me cold the first time I transcribed it, written in careful, old-fashioned cursive by a ranger whose name appeared regularly throughout an entire decade of logs. A woman who'd clearly worked this station with real dedication for years. Her entry simply read that she'd seen it again that night, exactly the same as the last 2 times, and that she wasn't going to write anything further about it beyond confirming the sighting, a brevity that struck me as its own kind of evidence. The restraint of somebody who'd clearly decided, deliberately, not to speculate further in an official record, even as she felt compelled to at least note the sighting itself, for whatever reason she never fully explained. I found myself, more than once during that transcription process, wondering about her specifically, what she'd actually seen that first time to make her decide the sighting deserved noting at all, and whether she'd ever told anyone else on her own crew what she genuinely believed about it beyond what made it into that careful, guarded handwriting. Another entry, considerably older, from a ranger working the station back when the whole operation still relied on kerosene lanterns, rather than any electric lighting, described the light in slightly more detail than most, noting specifically that it seemed to move with a kind of deliberate, patient quality, never rushing, never behaving the way any ordinary reflection or drifting fire would. A careful observation from somebody clearly practiced at watching flame and light sources closely a see. Part of their own daily work maintaining those same lanterns. I remember sitting with that particular entry for a long time before moving on to the next box, struck by how closely its description matched language other rangers, working decades later and with no possible knowledge of that earlier account, had independently used themselves. What I hadn't initially noticed, buried as these entries were among thousands of entirely mundane daily notations, was the pattern connecting them to something else entirely. I only caught it because my digitization work required me to cross-reference each logbook against our station's separate historical incident records. Formal reports of accidents, rescues, and fatalities going back the same many decades. Once I started noticing the light entries specifically, I began checking each one against the incident record for the days immediately following it, mostly out of simple curiosity rather than any serious expectation of finding anything. A small aside. Project I worked on during breaks from the main transcription task rather than anything I initially considered part of my actual assignment, staying late some evenings, well past when I could have reasonably called it a day, simply because I found myself genuinely unable to stop until I'd worked through the next few entries. The pattern, once I finally saw it clearly laid out across my own careful cross-referencing, unsettled me more than I expected it to. In case after case, spanning multiple different rangers and multiple different decades, a logged sighting of that light preceded, within a handful of days, a formal incident report involving somebody falling through weak ice, in several cases. Fatally, in a few others narrowly surviving thanks to a rescue that happened to reach them in time. I brought this pattern to Paul directly, printing out a careful timeline that laid the correlation out as clearly and objectively as I could manage, hoping the sheer, methodical documentation might land with him the way it had landed with me. He looked through it carefully, spreading the pages across his desk, and studying each connected case for a long, quiet moment before saying anything at all. And I want to be fair in saying he didn't dismiss it as nonsense outright, taking my documentation considerably more seriously than I'd initially expected him to. What he told me instead was, in its own way, harder to argue with than simple dismissal would have been. "I'm not saying nothing happened," he told me, tapping the timeline thoughtfully. "I'm saying I can't put this in a professional database as anything more than what it actually is, which is an interesting coincidence across a dataset small enough that coincidence remains a genuinely plausible explanation." He pointed out, correctly, that ice-related incidents happen with some regularity on a lake this large and this cold regardless of any preceding light sighting, and that a pattern-matching exercise across enough decades of data could plausibly surface a correlation like this one through simple chance alone, especially given how loosely and inconsistently the original light entries had been recorded in the first place, some rangers noting sightings that never appeared to correlate with anything at all, entries I'd found myself but hadn't included in my initial presentation to him, aware even as I compiled it that a fully honest accounting would have to include the misses alongside the hits. What Paul wanted, once we discussed it, was for the new digital archive to include only the verified, formal incident data, stripped entirely of the personal, anecdotal light entries that had accompanied them in the original handwritten logs. He framed this, reasonably from his own perspective, as simply cleaning up unverifiable noise from a professional historical record, not wanting future researchers or park staff pulling up an official database entry that included what would read out of context as unsubstantiated ghost story material sitting alongside legitimate incident data. A concern I understood completely, even as it left me with a nagging discomfort I couldn't fully articulate to him in terms he'd find professionally persuasive. I pushed back, carefully, suggesting we could include the light entries with clear notation that they were anecdotal and unverified, rather than removing them outright, but Paul held firm. And given that this was, ultimately, his project and his call to make, I proceeded with the digitization exactly as he'd instructed, quietly keeping my own private notes on the pattern, rather than simply letting it disappear entirely from my own awareness. It was perhaps 2 weeks after that conversation, running a routine winter patrol along a stretch of shoreline to check ice conditions and confirm our closure markers remained properly placed ahead of the weekend, that I saw it myself for the first time. I remember, too, the specific internal deliberation that passed through me in those first several seconds after spotting the light, weighing everything I'd learned against everything my training told me about the genuine physical danger of moving. Onto ice our own department had specifically closed that week, standing frozen in place on that shoreline for what felt like a considerably longer stretch of time than it probably actually was. I thought about simply calling it in and letting a larger, properly equipped team respond in daylight, the more conventional, cautious choice available to me in that moment, the choice most of my formal training would have explicitly recommended, given the closure notices already in place for that exact stretch of ice. I thought, too, about every single log entry I'd transcribed describing this exact light, and about how many of those entries had been followed, within days, by an incident report describing somebody who hadn't been found in time, names, and dates. Could still recall clearly even weeks after transcribing them. I made my decision in considerably less time than it's taken me to describe it to you now, radioing my intentions before I'd fully finished reasoning through them, some part of me apparently deciding the matter before the rest of me had caught up. The evening had been ordinary right up until that point, cold and clear in the way Lake Superior winter nights often are once a weather system finally clears out. Stars sharp overhead, the whole shoreline quiet except for the occasional distant crack and groan of shifting ice, a sound anybody who's spent real time on a frozen lake eventually learns to distinguish from anything actually dangerous. I'd finished my checks and was making my way back toward my vehicle in the deepening evening dark when a pale, drifting light caught my attention out over the ice, some considerable distance offshore, moving slowly and deliberately in a way that didn't match anything I could easily attribute to a stray headlamp or a distant vehicle's reflection. I stood there for a long moment, my own breath fogging in the bitter cold, watching it drift, unhurried, across a stretch of ice our own closure, notices explicitly marked as unsafe for travel that particular week given a recent thaw and refreeze. Cycle that had left the ice considerably weaker than it appeared from a distance. I remember checking, almost reflexively, for any obvious explanation. Another patrol vehicle. A snowmobile out where it shouldn't be. Anything at all that might account for a light moving across terrain we'd specifically closed for exactly this kind of danger. I found nothing. The light continued its slow, patient drift regardless of my searching. Entirely unhurried. entirely unbothered by my own presence watching it from shore. And I remember the strange, specific stillness of that moment, standing at the edge of closed, dangerous ice, watching something my own careful searching couldn't account for. Weeks of methodical, professional cross-referencing suddenly colliding directly with my own two eyes, rather than remaining safely theoretical inside a spreadsheet. I want to be honest about this specific immediate recognition that moved through me in that moment. Nothing like the slow, gradual unease that builds in some of the other accounts you've heard tonight, but an instant, complete certainty, drawn directly from weeks of careful cross-referencing rather than any inherited family folklore, that I was looking at exactly the same phenomenon dozens of rangers before me had logged in exactly the same understated, uncertain language on exactly the same understated kind of night. That pattern had always preceded something considerably worse within the following few days. I made the decision, standing there on that shoreline, to trust the pattern rather than dismiss it, moving out onto the ice myself, carefully, testing thickness with a spud bar, every few steps exactly the way our own ice safety training requires. Following the light's general direction rather than trying to close the distance to it directly, treating it less like a destination to reach and more like a bearing worth respecting, a distinction that mattered enormously to how I actually conducted myself out there physically, regardless of whatever unusual reasoning had gotten me moving in the first place. I want to emphasize that this wasn't blind faith overriding my professional training. It was, if anything, my professional training and the pattern working together, careful ice assessment guiding every physical step I actually took, while the light simply told me which general direction seemed worth that careful assessment in the first place. I radioed dispatch before I'd taken more than a few steps out, giving my position and my intention as clearly and factually as I could manage, describing what I was seeing without editorializing about what I thought it might mean, aware even in that tense moment of exactly how that report would eventually read to anybody reviewing it later. The dispatcher on duty that night, a colleague I'd worked alongside for several years by that point, asked only the practical questions protocol required, confirming my exact bearing and requesting updates at set intervals without any hint of skepticism or concern beyond the ordinary caution any solo ice movement warranted regardless of the reason behind it. I remember being grateful, in that specific moment, for a colleague professional enough to simply do her job, without demanding an explanation I wasn't entirely ready to give over an open radio channel anyway. Her steady, familiar voice checking in ATE way, each interval a genuine comfort against the isolation of that dark, empty stretch of ice. I moved across that ice for what felt like a considerable distance, checking my bearing repeatedly against the light, which continued its slow, steady drift somewhere ahead of me without ever seeming to draw meaningfully closer. My radio keeping our meaningfully closer. My radio keeping our dispatch informed of my position at regular intervals exactly as protocol required for any solo movement onto ice that far from shore. The cold worked at me steadily the entire time, my breath freezing almost instantly on the scarf pulled up over my lower face, each careful spud bar test sending a dull, familiar thud, echoing across the otherwise silent ice around me. The specific, focused discipline of that methodical testing, keeping my mind anchored to procedure even as the light itself kept pulling at something considerably less rational underneath that procedure. It was the sound that finally redirected my attention away from the light itself, a faint, ragged shout carried across the ice from somewhere off to my left, considerably closer to my actual position than the light itself had ever gotten. I changed direction immediately, moving as quickly as I safely could toward the sound, and within a few minutes my headlamp beam caught a man partially submerged in open water where the ice had given way beneath him. Both arms hooked over the eye, wore a matl. Hi gig with you or do you ride by day I thought. I knew us. Surviving edge, clearly exhausted and losing strength fast in water that cold, his ice fishing gear scattered uselessly on the solid ice a short distance away from where he'd fallen through checking one of his own tip-ups. "Help!" he called out again, weaker this time, his voice already carrying the particular slurred quality that sets in fast once cold water starts genuinely affecting a person's ability to think and speak clearly. I called back immediately, identifying myself, telling him to hold on. That help had arrived and I was coming to get him out, working to keep my own voice as calm and steady as I could manage despite my heart hammering against my ribs. I learned, once he'd recovered enough to talk properly, that the man I'd pulled from the water was a long-time local resident, well known throughout the community as an experienced ice fisherman who'd worked that particular stretch of lake for the better part of 3 decades, exactly the kind of seasoned local hand who wouldn't ordinarily be caught off guard by ice conditions he'd have every reason to know intimately. He spent several days in the hospital under close observation, his core temperature having dropped low enough that the attending medical team wanted to monitor him carefully for any delayed complications before releasing him, a stay that gave both of us plenty of time to talk properly once he'd recovered enough strength for real conversation. I visited him twice during that stay, and I remember him telling me on that second visit that he still couldn't fully explain to his own satisfaction why he'd decided to check that particular tip-up at exactly the moment the ice gave way. A small, personal echo of the same kind of unresolved question I was carrying myself about exactly why I'd been out on that stretch of shoreline at exactly the right moment to hear him. He told me, once he felt steady enough to walk me through it, that the specific spot he'd fallen through had always been reliable in years past, a stretch he'd fished safely dozens of times before, and that nothing about that evening's conditions had given him any warning at all before the ice simply gave way beneath him, without any of the usual cracking or shifting that typically provides at least some advance notice. That detail struck me as significant once I had time to sit with it properly. A genuinely experienced local expert caught by surprise on ground he trusted completely. Exactly the kind of unpredictable, sudden failure that makes this lake as dangerous as it is even to people who've spent a lifetime learning to read it. Backup. Search personnel reached us not long after I'd gotten him stable. Additional rangers who'd mobilized the moment my radio call made clear the situation had escalated beyond routine patrol, arriving with additional cold weather gear and a properly equipped rescue sled that made the remaining trip back to shore considerably faster and safer than continuing to half-carry him myself would have managed. An ambulance was waiting at our nearest access point by the time we reached solid ground, our local emergency medical crew working with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from a rural community where everybody involved in emergency response has trained together for years, wrapping him immediately in warming blankets and starting careful rewarming protocols even during the short drive to the nearest hospital, equipped to handle severe hypothermia properly. I rode along in the ambulance rather than following separately, wanting to stay with him through that critical transition. And I remember him gripping my hand at one point, his own still shaking uncontrollably from the cold, managing only a single quiet thank you before the medical team's own urgent work took over the rest of that ride. I want to describe the next several minutes as carefully as I can, because that kind of ice rescue requires a very specific, practiced sequence, rather than simply rushing toward somebody in obvious distress, which would risk putting a second person through the same weak ice entirely. I got down flat, distributing my own weight across as wide an area as possible, and worked my way carefully toward him, extending a length of rope I always carry specifically for exactly this kind of situation, talking to him steadily the entire time, keeping him focused and responsive as his own strength visibly continued fading, asking him simple, direct questions. His name, how long he'd been in the water, anything to keep him actively engaged rather than letting his mind drift toward the dangerous, sleepy confusion cold water eventually induces. Getting him fully out took several long, difficult minutes of careful, coordinated effort, both of us working together against water, actively trying to pull him back under, his own weakened arms barely able to help pull himself forward even with the rope's support. Before I finally managed to drag him fully onto solid ice, immediately working to get him into dry layers and moving towards shore before hypothermia could finish what that fall through the ice had already started. Half carrying him the considerable distance back to solid ground while radioing ahead for emergency medical support to meet us at the nearest access point. I want to walk you through what happened to that exact rescue site overnight, because it's the one detail in this account with an entirely ordinary explanation. I'd marked the location carefully before we made our way back to shore, flagging the weak ice hole for follow-up documentation the following morning, hoping to properly assess and photograph the hazard for our own updated ice safety records, driving in a marker pole deep enough that I felt confident it would hold through overnight wind and any minor ice movement. When I returned at first light, that entire stretch of open water had refrozen completely overnight, the surface indistinguishable from any other section of solid ice around it, my flag marker standing over ground that gave no visible indication anything had happened there at all less than 12 hours earlier, the new ice smooth and unbroken right up to the base of my own marker pole. I want to be honest that standing there that morning, looking at ground that had nearly killed a man only hours before now, sitting perfectly ordinary and solid beneath my boots, was its own kind of unsettling experience entirely separate from anything involving the light itself, a specific quiet reminder of how completely this landscape erases its own history within a single cold night, leaving almost nothing behind for anyone arriving even a few hours later to properly understand what had actually happened there. Lake Superior ice, under the kind of extreme cold that had settled in that same night, can refreeze open water remarkably fast, a well-documented seasonal phenomenon our own ice safety training specifically warns about. Dangerous new ice forming deceptively quickly over exactly the kind of weak spot that had nearly killed somebody only hours before, thin and treacherous in ways that make it, if anything, more dangerous immediately afterward than the original hole had been, since new ice gives no visible warning of the danger still sitting just beneath its deceptively solid-looking surface. It wasn't a mystery. It was simply Lake Superior doing, efficiently and predictably, what that lake reliably does in genuinely cold conditions. And it cost me the physical evidence I'd hoped to properly document, though I marked that entire stretch with extended caution. Tape regardless, unwilling to trust even freshly formed ice without proper testing first. I reported the full incident to Paul directly the following morning, including, this time without any hesitation, the complete role that light and the logbook pattern had played in getting me to that stranded fisherman in time to actually save him. I want to describe Paul's reaction carefully, because it wasn't the simple, immediate vindication I might have half expected given everything that had just happened. He sat with the full account for a long moment, clearly working through the specific tension between what his own professional standards told him about unverifiable anecdotal data and what had just undeniably happened to one of his own rangers, the previous night, his hands folded on his desk, his usual quick, decisive manner noticeably absent throughout that entire conversation. "I need to think about this properly," he told me, which struck me, at the time, as a genuinely honest response rather than the kind of deflection I might have expected from somebody less willing to sit with real discomfort. He called me back into his office 2 days later, having clearly spent considerable time working through exactly how to reconcile what had happened with his own professional standards. A legal pad on his desk, covered in notes he'd apparently mad at, working through the specific ethical and professional dimensions of the whole situation over those 2 days. What he told me eventually was that he still couldn't in good conscience present that logbook pattern as anything resembling confirmed scientific fact within an official Park Service database, and I understood and largely agreed with that position. even in the immediate aftermath of everything that had just happened. I've read enough incident reports in my career to know how easily a single dramatic outcome can distort somebody's read of a much larger dataset, he told me. Careful and measured even now. One successful rescue doesn't prove a pattern any more than the deaths already in that dataset disprove one. I want to be honest with you about that. But he also told me, considerably more reluctantly, that he wasn't prepared to simply delete a pattern that had just directly contributed to saving a man's life, regardless of how uncomfortable that pattern made him feel professionally. We eventually settled on a compromise that satisfied both of our concerns reasonably well, preserving the light entries in our new digital archive exactly as originally written, but adding a clear, prominent notation identifying them as anecdotal, historical observations of undetermined cause, rather than presenting them as anything approaching verified fact, a framing honest enough to satisfy his professional standards while still ensuring the pattern itself survived intact for whichever future ranger might eventually need it the way I had. Our working relationship, Paul's and mine, actually deepened considerably in the months following that whole episode. An unexpected outcome given how tense our disagreement had briefly been. He started asking me, periodically, whether I'd noted anything else worth flagging in the historical record, as I continued working through the remaining logbooks. A genuine curiosity that had nothing performative about it, and I came to respect him. More, rather than less, for how honestly he'd wrestled with a situation that genuinely challenged his own professional framework, rather than either dismissing it outright or overcorrecting into uncritical belief. He told me once, near the end of that winter, sharing coffee together in his office on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, that the whole experience had made him a more careful reader of exactly what kind of evidence a modern archive should, and shouldn't discard. A lesson, he said, he intended to carry into every future project he oversaw, regardless of how confident he initially felt about any given piece of unconventional information. I finished the full digitization project by early spring, several thousand individual entries eventually transcribed and cross-referenced into a searchable database, considerably more useful than the original paper logs had ever been for any future researcher or ranger needing quick access to our station's history. A genuine improvement to how our station manages its own institutional memory, regardless of everything else that particular winter also taught me. The light entries sit there still, exactly where Paul and I agreed to place them, each one carrying its careful, honest notation. A small, permanent acknowledgement built into an otherwise entirely conventional professional record. I still work this same station, and I've continued the tradition, if that's the right word for it, of logging my own light sightings, with exactly the same careful, understated language my predecessors used, across all those decades I once transcribed. By hand. I've seen it twice more since that night, each time treating it with the same immediate, serious respect I learned to give it that first time, each time following the same careful, professional protocol of trusting the general bearing while relying entirely on proper ice safety technique for the actual physical movement, and each time, thankfully, without needing to make the same difficult ice crossing again to confirm why. Both subsequent sightings resolving without any incident I could ever connect to them. Exactly the kind of inconclusive outcome that keeps this whole pattern honestly uncertain rather than neatly confirmed. The fisherman I pulled from that water recovered fully, and he's become, somewhat to his own continued embarrassment, a fairly outspoken advocate for ice safety awareness throughout our local community, sharing his own account at winter safety presentations I still occasionally get invited to help him give, standing up in front of church basements and community centers describing, in his own steady practiced words, exactly how quickly a routine afternoon of ice fishing can turn into the worst night of a person's life. He's never once asked me exactly how I knew to be out on that particular stretch of ice on that particular night, and I've never quite found the right way to bring it up voluntarily myself, letting him simply believe, as far as I know, that it was ordinary routine patrol timing rather than anything stranger than that. A small private omission I've made my peace with over the years since. I think often about how close that entire pattern came to simply disappearing, quietly and permanently, into a database that would have looked, on paper, considerably more professional and complete without it. I understand Paul's original instinct completely, and I don't think it came from anywhere except a genuine, well-intentioned commitment to institutional credibility. The same instinct, honestly, that probably would have guided my own decision-making. If I had been the one setting up that archive from scratch, rather than the one who'd spent weeks getting quietly, personally attached to the specific pattern buried inside it. But I'm deeply grateful, every single winter since, that we found a way to keep that pattern alive in our official record anyway. However carefully hedged and qualified its final framing turned out to be. A quiet acknowledgement, buried in an otherwise ordinary database, that some of what keeps people safe out on that ice was never going to fit neatly into the kind of evidence a modern incident report is built to require. Ranger Halvorsen still logs his own light sightings in exactly the same careful, understated language his predecessors once used. Our next story takes us to the New River Gorge in West Virginia, to a stretch of Appalachian country that sits near some of the most famous cryptid folklore in the entire country, where a ranger learned that sometimes the most frightening thing you can encounter in the dark is actually trying to save your life. This story comes from the ranger who very nearly ignored a warning that ended up preventing a genuine catastrophe. This is Ranger Colleen Rhodes. My name is Colleen Rhodes, and I have proudly worked as a ranger at New River Gorge National Park in West Virginia for most of my entire, genuinely fulfilling career. A park built around one of the oldest rivers on the entire continent, cutting a deep, dramatic gorge through Appalachian mountains that carry their own long history of coal mining, railroad construction, and the particular hard-won folklore that grows up naturally around communities who spent generations working genuinely dangerous industrial terrain, folklore considerably older and more deeply rooted in this region than most visitors passing through for a weekend of hiking or rock climbing ever fully appreciate. I grew up not far from here myself, in a small, tight-knit Appalachian town where half the families, mine included, had some connection to the old coal industry that once defined this entire region, an inheritance that gave me an early, practical respect for exactly how dangerous old industrial infrastructure can remain long after its original purpose has faded. I want to say a little more about that inheritance because it shapes how I approached everything that followed. My own grandfather worked the mines here for the better part of his life, starting as a teenager and continuing well into his 60s before failing health finally forced him to stop. And he used to tell me when I was young about the particular caution older miners carried toward certain warning signs, canaries falling silent, timber creaking in unfamiliar patterns, small, easily dismissed details that experienced miners learned never to ignore regardless of how little scientific explanation accompanied them at the time. He told me once that the miners who survived longest weren't necessarily the strongest or most skilled, but the ones who took every small, unexplained warning seriously rather than talking themselves out of caution through sheer force of rational argument. That inherited respect for taking small, unexplained warnings seriously, I think, shaped how I eventually responded to everything I'm about to describe considerably more than any of my formal Park Service training ever did. This is the story of an old railroad trestle bridge, slated for careful, thoughtful renovation into a public pedestrian walkway, and of a pattern of visitor sightings I very nearly dismissed entirely before it ended up being the only reason a genuine catastrophe never actually happened. A story I still find myself turning over regularly, years later, whenever I walk that same span with visitors on an ordinary afternoon shift. I will want to tell you about the specific structure at the very center of this account, because its history matters. The trestle in question had originally been built well over a century ago to move coal out of this gorge. A genuine feat of period engineering that had sat largely unused for decades once the mines it served finally closed, its rusted iron frame still standing remarkably against a century of weather and neglect. I remember hiking out to see it myself for the first time as a new ranger, struck by the particular, dignified way it seemed to hold itself against that dramatic gorge backdrop, a structure that had clearly earned its continued survival through genuine engineering quality rather than any lucky accident of preservation, its rust-streaked frame somehow still conveying a quiet, patient strength, despite decades of exposure to that gorge's genuinely harsh weather patterns. Our park, working alongside the state's transportation department, had spent several years planning its careful renovation into a public walkway, part of a broader regional effort to convert old industrial infrastructure into heritage tourism assets. A project that had generated real local excitement well before anything strange ever started happening around it. Communities throughout this region had watched similar conversions succeed elsewhere, old rail lines and industrial structures finding genuine new purpose as public recreational assets, and our own project had drawn considerable regional attention and support from the moment its funding was first secured, local business owners and historical societies alike treating it as exactly the kind of project this area badly needed after decades of economic decline following the coal industry's own long collapse. I attended several community planning meetings myself during the early stages of that project, watching longtime residents, many of them former mining families like my own, describe what that particular structure meant to them. Personally, memories of relatives who'd worked the rail lines it once served, hopes for what its renovation might bring to a local economy that had struggled considerably since the mines themselves finally closed for good. One elderly gentleman whose own father had worked as a brakeman on that exact line decades earlier stood up at one meeting and spoke for several minutes about watching that trestle from his childhood bedroom window, describing it with a genuine window reverence that stuck with me long afterward, treating its planned restoration as something considerably more meaningful than simple infrastructure work. That genuine community investment mattered enormously to how seriously everyone eventually took the strange pattern that emerged, since nobody involved, myself included, wanted anything to derail a project this many people had already invested so much genuine hope in. The first sightings came in through our ordinary visitor contact channels. Exactly the kind of report our station receives, regularly and mostly resolves without any real drama. Hikers describing an unusual bird or animal glimpsed near the trestle at dusk. What made these particular reports gradually stand out over the following several weeks was both their volume and their remarkable consistency. Visitors with no connection to each other, arriving on entirely different days, began independently describing something considerably larger and stranger than any bird. A winged, roughly humanoid figure, most consistently described by the unsettling detail of its eyes, which multiple unconnected visitors each described as glowing a distinct, vivid red in whatever light briefly caught them. I remember one particular report that stayed with me longer than most, from a family who'd stopped at an overlook near the trestle specifically to photograph the sunset, their teenage daughter capturing what she initially assumed was simply an unusual bird silhouette against the fading light, only noticing, once she reviewed the photo more closely later that evening, a shape and posture that struck her as considerably less bird-like than she'd first assumed. She'd emailed the photo directly to our visitor services office, apologetic and slightly embarrassed, asking only whether we could help identify what she'd actually photographed, a question none of our own wildlife staff could confidently answer. Despite genuine, careful effort spread across multiple staff members over several days of discussion, our staff biologist eventually admitting after careful study, that the proportions simply didn't match any bird species native to this region. Convincingly enough to feel confident in that explanation, a rare, notable concession from someone normally quite confident identifying any wildlife image that crossed her desk. I called that family directly, curious enough to want more detail than the brief email had provided, and spoke with the mother for nearly 20 minutes, her voice carrying the particular, careful tone of someone who clearly worried about sounding foolish even while remaining genuinely convinced of what her own daughter had captured. She described the whole family's reaction in the moment, a shared, sudden unease that had sent them back to their car considerably faster than their planned sunset photography session usually took, none of them fully understanding why they'd all felt compelled to leave until reviewing that photograph properly, once they were home and safely inside. Her own husband, she told me, still occasionally bringing up that evening, months later, unable to fully shake the memory despite how firmly he generally dismissed anything resembling the supernatural in his own ordinary daily life. I want to be honest that I treated these early reports the way any experienced ranger treats an unusual wildlife sighting report, with polite professional interest and a healthy default toward mundane explanation. Large owls, particularly at dusk with backlighting from a setting sun, can genuinely produce startling, humanoid-seeming silhouettes to an unprepared eye, and I logged the first dozen or so reports with exactly that explanation in mind, filing them, alongside the ordinary volume of slightly exaggerated wildlife encounters every park receives regularly from excited visitors. It was our project state transportation department liaison, a man named Grant Ostrander, who first brought these reports to my attention as a problem requiring active management rather than simple routine logging. Grant had worked in state infrastructure funding and public communications for close to 15 years by that point, skilled at exactly the kind of careful, coordinated messaging that major public infrastructure projects require to maintain political corral and community support across multi-year timelines. I'd worked alongside him closely throughout the entire prior year of planning, and I want to be fair in saying I generally found him competent and genuinely committed to the project's success, if occasionally more focused on public perception than public perception. I found entirely comfortable in a role also responsible, at least partially, for public safety communication. Grant oversaw the funding and public rollout for our trestle renovation project, and he arrived at our station one afternoon considerably more agitated than I'd seen him throughout the entire prior year of our working relationship, holding up his phone to show me a local social media post that had begun circulating, tagging our park directly, describing one visitor's encounter in dramatic, breathless detail that had already attracted hundreds of comments and shares within just a single day. This is exactly the kind of thing that derails a project like this one, he told me, pacing slightly in our small station office. We spent years building support for this renovation on its actual merits, the history, the economic value, the recreational access. I am not going to let it get overshadowed by a ghost story. Grant's concern, understandably from his own professional position, centered almost entirely on how these sightings might affect public perception of a renovation project he'd spent years securing funding and political support for. He worried, openly, that a viral cryptid story might overshadow the genuine heritage and economic value the project represented, or worse, attract exactly the kind of thrill-seeking visitor behavior that tends to accompany any popular cryptid sighting location, visitors trespassing after hours or ignoring safety barriers hoping for their own encounter. A genuine and legitimate safety concern I understood even as I disagreed with his proposed solution to it. Grant asked me directly, that first tense conversation, whether our station could simply stop actively logging these particular reports, treating them as an internal nuisance rather than genuine visitor communication worth documenting formally. I told him as diplomatically as I could manage that I wasn't comfortable simply suppressing visitor reports regardless of how inconvenient their content happened to be for anyone's public relations concerns. I know, These are people telling us what they experienced on federal land, I told him. I can control how we communicate about it publicly. I'm not willing to just stop writing it down. Grant accepted that position with visible reluctance rather than genuine agreement, clearly frustrated but professional enough not to push the point further once I'd made my own position clear. We settled, that first conversation, on a compromise where I'd continue logging the reports internally without actively promoting or publicly commenting on them. A resolution that satisfied neither of us completely, but that both of us could professionally live with. Grant leaving that meeting, still visibly unhappy, but no longer actively pressing for anything beyond what I'd already agreed to. It was perhaps 2 weeks after that conversation, working through our accumulated sighting log during a slow afternoon shift, that I first noticed something that would eventually change how seriously I took the entire situation. Our renovation project required regular structural inspections throughout the planning phase. Engineering assessments conducted at scheduled intervals to track the old trestle's condition as renovation work progressed. Purely out of idle curiosity, cross-referencing dates rather than expecting to find anything meaningful, I checked our sighting log against the public schedule of these inspection dates and found something that genuinely unsettled me. Once I saw it laid out clearly. On 3 separate occasions across those first several weeks, a noticeable cluster of visitor sightings had occurred in the days immediately preceding an inspection that subsequently flagged a new structural concern. Concerns ranging from minor rate surface corrosion to, in one case, a section of decking requiring immediate safety barrier installation. I want to be careful about how I describe my own reaction to this pattern, because I don't want to overstate how quickly I moved from simple curiosity to genuine concern. My first instinct, entirely reasonable given my professional training, was to assume coincidence. A plausible explanation given how frequently both sightings and inspection findings were already occurring across a busy renovation project with regular, scheduled assessments. I actually set the timeline aside for nearly a full week after first noticing it, telling myself I was almost certainly seeing a pattern in what was really just ordinary statistical noise. The kind of coincidental clustering that any sufficiently large dataset eventually produces if you go looking for it hard enough. But the specific timing kept nagging at me, 3 instances feeling like more than I could comfortably dismiss as pure chance, especially given how specific and consistent the visitor descriptions themselves remained across every single report. Details matching closely enough between complete strangers that simple imagination or expectation bias felt like an increasingly strained explanation the more reports I read carefully. I found myself returning to that timeline more than once during otherwise unrelated shifts, unable to fully set the question aside the way I initially told myself I should. I brought this pattern to Felix Bratton, the lead structural engineer overseeing our renovation project, rather than to Grant, correctly anticipating that Felix's professional perspective would treat the correlation as a legitimate engineering question worth investigating regardless of whatever unusual details accompanied it. Felix had worked on historic infrastructure renovation projects across several states over a long career, methodical and unflappable in exactly the way you'd want from somebody responsible for certifying century-old iron safe for public use. A quiet, deliberate man who'd built his entire professional reputation on exactly the kind of careful, evidence-based judgment that made him genuinely difficult to rattle with anything short of solid data. Colleagues throughout the industry regularly describing him, whenever his name came up, as one of the most conservative and cautious engineers they'd ever worked alongside. Precisely the reputation that made his eventual willingness to take my sighting pattern seriously carry so much genuine weight. I want to describe our first conversation about this carefully, because Felix's response set the entire tone for everything that followed. I met him at the site office trailer we used for a project coordination, a cramped, practical space cluttered with blueprints and equipment catalogs, spreading my printed timeline across his desk, the same way I had for Grant, though bracing myself. This time, for a considerably more skeptical reception given how much more Felix's entire career depended on rigorous, verifiable physical evidence rather than anything resembling visitor anecdote. He listened to my full account without interrupting, studying a timeline I had prepared with the same careful attention he brought to any engineering data, turning each page slowly, occasionally cross-referencing dates against a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, and when he finally looked up, his expression held genuine, focused curiosity rather than the dismissiveness I'd half expected. "I don't care what's causing people to report something near that trestle," he told me. "What I care about is whether there's a real correlation between those reports and structural findings. Because if there is, that's useful information regardless of where it's coming from." He agreed on the spot to cross-reference his own more detailed engineering data against my sighting timeline, treating the whole question with a rigor that struck me as remarkably open-minded for somebody whose entire career depended on hard, verifiable physical evidence. What Felix found, working through his own considerably more detailed inspection records over the following days, unsettled him more than either of us expected it to, spending several long evenings after his normal work hours cross-referencing every citing data against his own team's detailed field notes rather than simply relying on the summary reports Grant's office typically received. The correlation held up even more strongly under his closer analysis, citing clusters preceding not just any structural finding, but specifically preceding findings in one particular section of the trestle's central span, a stretch of aging iron support structure that had, so far, tested within acceptable safety margins despite showing more general wear than some other sections of the same overall structure. Our renovation project had a scheduled test load assessment approaching within the following 2 weeks. A critical milestone where engineers would apply carefully calculated weight to the structure to verify its capacity before any public opening could be approved. A routine but genuinely significant procedure for any historic structure being certified for modern public use. In the days immediately before that scheduled assessment, sighting reports intensified dramatically, considerably more frequent and considerably more detailed than anything we'd logged previously, several visitors independently describing the figure positioned directly on or near that exact central span section Felix's data had already flagged as concerning. I remember sitting with Felix in his site office late one evening, both of us reviewing the intensifying pattern together, neither of us saying out loud what we were both clearly thinking, that waiting for the already scheduled test load event to potentially confirm our concerns felt considerably riskier than simply going out to look ourselves first. Felix broke that particular silence eventually, setting down the report he'd been reviewing and telling me plainly that he wasn't willing to let his crew apply real test weight to that structure in 2 days without personally satisfying himself beforehand, that nothing about that specific section warranted more urgent attention than our normal inspection schedule allowed for. Felix and I made the decision together, given how directly the intensifying pattern seemed to point toward that specific location right before a scheduled test that would apply real physical stress to it, to conduct an immediate off-schedule closer inspection of that exact span before the formal test load assessment proceeded, rather than simply waiting for the already scheduled event to potentially confirm our concerns the hard way. We agreed to go out that same week, deliberately choosing an evening rather than full daylight, since nearly every sighting report we'd logged had occurred sometime after dusk, a decision that felt, at the time, like simple methodological consistency, rather than the genuinely unsettling choice it would eventually turn out to be. We went out that same evening, working under portable floodlights rigged for exactly this kind of after-hours inspection work, moving carefully along the trestle's narrow maintenance walkway toward the flagged central span, our boots ringing against central span, our boots ringing against decades-old iron grating in a steady, echoing rhythm that seemed unusually loud against the gorge's otherwise near total silence. The gorge below us sat almost entirely dark by that point, the river a faint, distant murmur far beneath the structure. Our own footsteps and equipment, the only real sound accompanying us across that long exposed span. I remember the specific, growing unease that built steadily the further we moved from solid ground. An unease I attributed at the time entirely to ordinary nervousness about working at height after dark, rather than anything more specific. I want to describe what happened next as carefully and honestly as I can, because it's the single strangest experience of my entire career. And I don't have a comfortable, tidy explanation to offer for any of it. We were perhaps 2/3 of the way across when both of us stopped simultaneously, neither one of us needing to say anything to the other. An overwhelming physical wave of dread settling over both of us at once, considerably beyond ordinary. Nervousness about working at height after dark, a specific bodily terror that felt, in the moment, almost like a physical pressure pressing directly against my own chest. I looked up, and there, perched on the very section of iron support structure Felix's data had flagged, was a shape I still struggle to fully describe, large, unmistakably winged, roughly humanoid in its general proportions, its eyes catching our roller floodlights and throwing back a vivid, unnatural red glow that seemed to bore directly into me with an intensity that had nothing ordinary about it at all. I remember trying, in that first frozen moment, to apply every rational explanation my own training offered. A large bird, an unusual reflection, some trick of our own floodlight against the old iron structure, and finding each explanation collapsing almost instantly against the sheer, undeniable physical presence of whatever was actually perched there watching us. Neither Felix nor I moved for what felt like a considerable stretch of time, both of us frozen by a fear that felt less like ordinary startlement, and more like something being actively imposed on us from outside our own minds. A specific, overwhelming pressure that made simply standing there feel like an act of real physical effort. I remember Felix's hand finding my arm at some point during that frozen stretch, gripping tightly enough that I felt it clearly even through my own jacket. Neither of us speaking, both of us apparently understanding without needing to discuss it. That neither one of us was capable of taking another step forward in that moment, regardless of what our professional obligations technically required of us. The figure didn't move toward us, didn't make any sound at all that either of us could identify afterward, simply remaining exactly where it was, watching, until finally, as if some unspoken threshold had been reached, it spread those enormous wings and lifted away into the dark, gone from view within seconds, leaving both of us shaking, adrenaline draining out of us in a way that left my knees genuinely unsteady on that narrow walkway. Neither of us made any attempt to continue forward onto that exact section of span that night, both of us retreating carefully back the way we'd come, working in near total silence beyond the essential practical communication required to safely navigate our way off that structure in the dark. I remember every single step of that retreat feeling considerably longer than the equivalent distance had felt on our way out, both of us checking over our shoulders more than once despite neither of us seeing anything further. The gorge around us, settling back into its ordinary, quiet darkness in a way that somehow felt more unsettling than reassuring given everything we'd just witnessed. It was only once we'd made it fully back to solid ground, sitting in Felix's truck with the heater running while both of us worked to steady our own breathing, that either of us said much of anything about what we'd actually just experienced. I remember Felix simply staring straight ahead through the windshield for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice considerably quieter and less certain than I had ever heard it throughout our entire prior working relationship. "I need you to understand," he told me slowly, "that in 30 years of this work, I have never once had an experience I couldn't eventually explain through some combination of fatigue, weather, or simple misperception. I don't have an explanation for that." Felix, once he'd recovered enough composure to speak clearly, told me plainly that whatever had just happened, professionally, he wasn't prepared to let that specific span go untested before the scheduled load assessment now, not after being physically prevented from reaching it under circumstances neither of us could rationally explain. He arranged, first thing the following morning, for an emergency, closer engineering assessment of that exact section, using specialized equipment capable of detecting internal structural flaws invisible to ordinary visual inspection, calling in a specialized ultrasonic testing crew from the state office on an emergency basis, rather than waiting for the standard scheduling process that would normally have taken considerably longer to arrange. I met Felix at the site early that following morning, both of us moving with the particular focused urgency of people who genuinely didn't know yet whether they were chasing something real or simply reacting to their own shared, unexplained fear from the previous night. Neither of us had slept well, and I remember the specific bleary-eyed quality of that early morning meeting. Both of us drinking coffee too quickly while waiting for the testing crew to finish setting up their equipment, exchanging occasional glances that carried more genuine uncertainty than either of us wanted to put into actual words just yet. The testing crew worked methodically across the flagged section for the better part of that entire morning, running their equipment carefully along every inch of the structure Felix directed them toward, while both of us waited nearby, saying very little to each other, each lost in our own private processing of what we'd actually experienced. I remember watching the lead technician's face carefully throughout that process, trying to read anything meaningful in his expression as his equipment traced slowly along that specific stretch of iron, his own growing focus and repeated rescanning of one particular area, eventually telling both Felix and me, well before he said anything out loud, that he'd found something worth taking very seriously indeed. What that emergency assessment found stopped both of us cold. A severe fatigue crack, hidden entirely within the iron itself, invisible from any external inspection method previously used on that structure, ran most of the way through a critical support member in exactly the section where we'd encountered that figure. A flaw, Felix told me, with visible difficulty keeping his own voice steady, that would very likely have caused a catastrophic partial collapse of that entire span under the weight the scheduled test load assessment had been planning to apply. Just days later, he sat down heavily on a nearby equipment case once the testing crew confirmed their findings, running both hands through his hair, telling me quietly that in close to 30 years of engineering work, he'd never once had a discovery hit him quite that hard, the specific, dizzying awareness of exactly how close his own crew had come to applying real, calculated stress directly onto a structural member, already most of the way toward complete failure. A scenario that could easily have sent multiple workers and heavy equipment down into that gorge below us had the scheduled test proceeded as originally planned. I want to walk you through what happened to the physical evidence of our own strange encounter, because it's the one detail in this account with a straightforward, if slightly ironic, explanation. We noticed, in the immediate aftermath of that sighting, unusual scorch marks and deep gouges scored into the iron near exactly where the figure had perched. Marks neither of us could readily attribute to any ordinary cause, and we'd flagged the location carefully before leaving that night, intending to have it properly photographed and documented once daylight returned, marking the exact spot with bright tape and noting the precise coordinates in Felix's own field notebook. Once the fatigue crack was discovered the following morning, however, park and state engineering officials moved immediately to install emergency structural bracing across that entire section. Urgent, legitimate safety work that couldn't reasonably wait for photography given the severity of what had just been discovered. A full crew arriving within hours to begin the physically demanding work of stabilizing a structural member, already most of the way toward complete failure. I remember standing nearby watching that bracing crew work, torn between genuine relief that the danger was being addressed so quickly, and a quieter, more personal disappointment that the one piece of physical evidence connecting our strange encounter to something verifiable was disappearing beneath urgent, necessary steel supports, even as I watched. By the time anyone thought to return with a proper camera, that entire section was already encased in temporary support structure. The original marks completely obscured beneath bracing installed for reasons that had nothing to do with covering eye. Anything up and everything to do with basic public safety. It wasn't a mystery. It was simply urgent engineering work taking priority over documentation, exactly as it should have, and it cost us the one piece of physical evidence that might have made the stranger parts of this account easier for anyone to verify. A loss I've lost. Made my own peace with over time, since I understand completely why that bracing work couldn't reasonably have waited for anyone's photography schedule. I reported the full incident to Grant directly, including everything Felix and I had actually experienced on that trestle, and I want to describe his reaction carefully, because it wasn't the simple vindication either of us might have expected given how directly our strange encounter had led to averting a genuine catastrophe. He listened to the full account with visible discomfort, sitting very still throughout most of my explanation, clearly torn between genuine grateful relief that a disaster had been prevented and continued, deep professional reluctance to have anything resembling a cryptid encounter connected, even informally, to his renovation project's official record. "You're telling me," he said slowly, once I'd finished, "that the two of you are certain you saw something, and that thing kept you from walking onto a section that turned out to have a crack that could have killed people." I confirmed that this was, as plainly and accurately as I could state it, exactly what had happened, watching him process that statement with visible difficulty, his professional instinct to find some more conventional explanation clearly warring against the simple, undeniable sequence of events I'd just laid out for him. He asked me several more questions, careful and specific, checking whether either of us might have simply noticed the crack ourselves through some subtler, more conventional means we hadn't fully registered. Questions I answered as honestly as I could, telling him plainly that neither Felix nor I had any explanation beyond exactly what we'd already told him. He sat with that for a long moment, staring at his own hands before finally admitting quietly that he genuinely didn't know what to do with that information professionally. An honest admission that struck me as considerably more valuable than any confident position he might have offered instead. A rare moment of genuine vulnerability from a man whose entire career depended on projecting confident, polished certainty to the public. What Grant ultimately decided, after several days of clearly difficult internal deliberation, was to keep the official incident report focused entirely on the verifiable engineering facts: the fatigue crack, the emergency inspection, the successfully averted risk, while making no public reference whatsoever to the sightings or our own direct encounter. Privately, though, he thanked me, more sincerely than I think he fully knew how to express given his professional position, stopping by my station office unannounced one afternoon specifically to tell me so directly, rather than simply letting the gesture pass unspoken, and he quietly ensured, going forward, that any future unusual visitor reports near active construction or renovation sites within our jurisdiction would trigger a mandatory engineering review as a matter of internal policy, a genuine, lasting change even without any public acknowledgement of what had actually prompted it. The renovation project ultimately proceeded successfully once the fatigue crack was properly repaired, the delayed test load assessment completing without incident several weeks later than originally scheduled, and the trestle opened to the public the following spring exactly as originally planned, drawing the kind of enthusiastic regional attention Grant had always hoped for, entirely for the heritage tourism value he had originally envisioned, rather than anything stranger. I attended the opening ceremony myself, watching families and hikers cross that same span we'd walked in fear only months earlier. now perfectly safe, properly certified, carrying visitors across that dramatic gorge, exactly the way the whole project had always intended, local officials and community members alike gathering for speeches, and a ribbon cutting that drew considerably more attendance than any of us on the project team had originally anticipated. I remember standing near the back of that crowd, watching Grant deliver a genuinely moving speech about the structure's history and its renewed purpose, and feeling a specific, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with anything he was actually saying out loud, knowing exactly how differently that whole celebration might have unfolded if events had played out even slightly differently a few months earlier. Felix retired from active field work not long after that project concluded, choosing to close out a long, distinguished career with exactly the kind of dramatic, meaningful, save that most engineers, he told me once over a farewell drink, spend their whole professional lives hoping never to need a fitting, if genuinely strange, capstone to 30 years of careful, methodical work. He moved to be closer to his grandchildren in another state, and I remember our final conversation before he left, both of us sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the trestle site one last time, watching the sunset over the gorge in comfortable, easy silence neither of us felt any particular need to fill with further conversation about what we'd once experienced there together. The whole scene feeling, in its own quiet way, like a fitting close to everything we'd shared professionally. We've stayed in occasional contact since, and I know he's told the full story, carefully and honestly, to a small handful of trusted former colleagues over the years, always prefacing it the same way he told it to me that first morning after the fatigue crack was confirmed, that he still doesn't know what we actually saw, and that he stopped needing to know in order to remain grateful for it. He sent me a card last winter, a simple, brief note thanking me again for trusting my own instincts enough to bring him that original timeline, telling me he thinks about that night more often than he probably should. Still, all these years later, I still work this same park, and I still think often about that night on the trestle, about the specific, overwhelming quality of that fear, and about how directly it led us to exactly the discovery that ended up mattering most. I don't have any confident explanation for what Felix and I actually encountered out there, and I've stopped needing one, honestly. The same way I've stopped needing an explanation for why some patterns simply hold up under careful scrutiny, regardless of how uncomfortable their implications might be for anyone's tidy professional worldview. The sighting stopped entirely once that section was properly repaired, and they've never once resumed in all the years since, a silence I've chosen to accept gratefully, rather than question further. I walk that trestle now with visitors regularly, part of my ordinary interpretive duties, sharing its coal mining history and its careful engineering restoration with genuine pride, never once mentioning, unless somebody asks directly with real, specific curiosity, exactly what else that particular stretch of iron and gorge once showed two frightened people on a dark night, in more than enough time to matter. My name is Teresa Aldana, and for 31 years I have worn the uniform of a wilderness ranger in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico. I have pulled people out of flash floods, carried people out on litters, and twice I have carried people out who were already gone. Most of what I have seen in this job has a tidy, sad, explainable shape to it, even the parts that felt frightening while they were happening. A mountain lion sighting has an explanation. A hiker who goes quiet on the radio usually has one too. A dead battery, a wrong turn, a twisted ankle in a dead zone with no signal to call it in. I have built a career on believing that almost everything strange has an ordinary reason sitting underneath it, if you're patient enough to dig for it. This story does too, mostly. I want to say that up front, because I know how these things get told, and I don't want to promise you a monster I can't deliver. What I can promise you is a question I have never been able to close, even after the file itself was closed for good, stamped and signed, and filed away in a drawer in Silver City, where it will sit for the rest of my career, and probably long after. It started again on a Tuesday morning in the middle of monsoon season, with my phone ringing before I had finished my coffee. The call was from a young man named Sam Pruitt, a graduate student who had been backpacking solo along the middle fork of the Gila River. The way a lot of young men do out here, chasing the same kind of quiet that drew me to this job in the first place. He had camped 2 nights near the confluence where a side canyon called Coyote Wash cuts down into the river, and on his second morning, after a storm had rolled through overnight, he noticed that the far bank of the wash had sheared away in a long, clean slice the way a flood will sometimes cut a new face into old ground. Sticking out of that new bank, maybe waist high up from the stream bed, he found a boot. Not a boot buried loosely in silt, but a boot fused into a hard gray layer of dried mud, the kind of layer that takes years to form. Next to it, half exposed, was a bracelet of carved wooden beads, blackened but intact. He had the good sense not to dig. He photographed everything, marked the location with his GPS unit, and hiked out 2 days early to report it to the district office. When the photographs landed on my desk, I did not need anyone to tell me whose bracelet that was. I had helped his mother pick it out of a box of his belongings 11 years earlier, when there was nothing left to search for, but there was still nothing left to bury either. I asked Sam to come into the district office before I did anything else, partly for the file and partly for myself. He was younger than Caleb had been, jumpy in the particular way people get after they found something they weren't looking for, turning his water bottle over and over in his hands while he talked. He told me the ground out there hadn't looked disturbed in any way he could put a name to. No tracks. No sign that anyone had been down in that wash recently at all. He said the thing that stuck with him most wasn't the boot or the bracelet, but how cleanly the bank had sheared, like something had been cut with a blade rather than torn loose by water. I told him that was just what a flood does to ground that's been sitting undisturbed a long time. A clean vertical cut where the old bank finally gives way all at once. He nodded like he believed me. I mostly believed myself too. His name was Caleb Whitfield, and he was 24 years old when the Gila wilderness took him and never gave him back. Until, apparently, it changed its mind. I want to tell you about Caleb the way I understood him then, because I think it matters for what came later. He was a graduate student studying folklore and oral history, and he had come to the Gila that summer to interview old ranching families about the stories they told their children to keep them out of certain canyons after dark. This is not unusual work out here. The Gila Wilderness is the oldest designated wilderness area in the entire country, set aside decades before most people had ever heard the word ecology, and in a place that old, stories accumulate in the soil like everything else does. Caleb had been particularly interested in one story in particular, one he had heard from an old rancher named Warren Boyle, who by that point had been dead himself for almost 10 years, but whose stories had outlived him the way good stories do. Warren Boyle used to tell people that during the deep summer, when the sky went the color of a fresh bruise and the air smelled like a struck match before the first drop ever fell, something moved down in the washes ahead of the water. Not with the water, he'd say. Ahead of it. He said the old-timers used to watch the clouds build over the Mogollon Mountains and clear out of any dry wash they were standing in, not because they were afraid of drowning, though plenty of people out here have drowned in washes that were bone. Dry 20 minutes earlier, but because they said something used the flood as cover. He never gave the thing a name that stuck, and near as anyone can tell, it wasn't tied to any single culture's actual beliefs about this land, just the accumulated nervous habit of ranching families who had buried people in flash floods and needed somewhere to put the fear afterward. Caleb had collected a dozen or so variations of that same basic story from families, scattered across Grant County by the time he ever set foot near Coyote Wash, and his notes show he treated most of them the way any careful researcher would, as a pattern worth documenting rather than a claim worth believing. One rancher's widow told him the thing followed the sound of your own name, and that her grandfather refused to call for lost livestock during monsoon season for exactly that reason, choosing instead to whistle. Another family, further west toward the Arizona line, said their version didn't move ahead of the water at all, but waited at the bottom of the wash for whatever the flood brought down to it, patient as a fisherman. Caleb's notes describe the second story as probably the most interesting variant so far, structurally, which is the kind of sentence only a folklore student could write about something that would keep most people up at night. He was, by every account I've ever heard from people who knew him, a careful and skeptical young man. That matters to me. I don't think he went looking for anything except a good thesis chapter. And then, near as we can ever reconstruct it, Caleb decided to go see Coyote Wash for himself, because Warren Boyle's version of the story was the only one that mentioned carved marks on a specific rock face, and a researcher who has come that far does not turn around before finding the rock. He had a 5-day backcountry permit and a satellite messenger device that let him send short check-in texts even without cell service, which in the Gila is most places. His last confirmed message came in on what should have been day 3 of 5 days. It read, roughly, "Found old fire rings up the wash. Found marks cut into the rock face. We'll camp here tonight and hike out day after tomorrow, like planned." His mother, Denise Whitfield, kept a printout of that message for years. I know because she showed it to me more than once. He never sent another one. When his checkout date passed with no word and no vehicle showing up to move from the trailhead, his mother called the sheriff's office. And the sheriff's office called us. Because once you're inside the wilderness boundary, search and rescue out here runs through the Forest Service. I was younger then, only 7 years into the job, and I was paired with a man named Roy Kessler, who at the time ran Grant County's search and rescue coordination, and who had, by his own count, been part of more than 100 backcountry recoveries. By the time I ever met him, Roy was not an easy man to rattle. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later. We found Caleb's last camp on the second day of the search, up in Coyote Wash, exactly where his message said it would be. His tent was still standing. His pack was still inside it, food and stove and clothing all present and accounted for, which told us right away that whatever had happened, he had not simply wandered off on some unplanned side trip. People who leave their camp for an hour do not leave their stove and their water filter behind. Something had interrupted him, mid-stay, without warning. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no torn ground, nothing to suggest an animal encounter, though we did not rule that out. What there was, and what I have never quite stopped thinking about, was a small stone cairn about waist high, stacked with obvious care, sitting maybe 20 feet from his tent door, facing directly toward it. I photographed that cairn the first afternoon we found the camp. I photographed it again the following morning, before we widened our search radius up the canyon walls. In the second photograph, one of the stones near the top had been moved, rotated so a different face pointed outward. I noticed it in the field and dismissed it, because wind and wildlife move things, and because I had a missing person to find and no time to chase a feeling. I did not write it in my report. I have regretted that small omission for 11 years, not because I think it would have changed the outcome, but because I think it would have told someone, someday, that I was not the only one who noticed something was wrong about that camp before the sky ever opened up. The search itself, in the days after we found that camp, was the kind of grinding, methodical work that never makes it into how people imagine search and rescue. We worked grid patterns up both canyon walls, a dozen volunteers and 2 dog teams, and, for one afternoon, a helicopter out of Silver City that could only manage short passes before the canyon walls got too tight and too turbulent for safe flying. One of the dogs alerted hard on a boulder field about half a mile up from the camp, sat and barked the way a trained cadaver dog does when it has something, and we spent the better part of a day moving stone by hand in that heat, only to find nothing beneath it at all. The handler told me afterward that scent can pool strangely in canyon country, caught in eddies of wind the same way water catches in a plunge pool, and that a dog can alert on a place scent pass through, rather than a place anything is actually buried. I believed her then, and I believe her now. I only mention it because it was one more small, explainable thing that felt, in the moment, like something closer to being toyed with. Roy kept us disciplined about the weather the whole time, checking the forecast off a handheld radio every few hours, the way you learn to when the nearest real shelter is a 2-hour hike from wherever you happen to be standing. The morning of the third day, the forecast called for a chance of afternoon storms. Nothing unusual for the season. Nothing that made either of us think about pulling the search early. We searched for 2 more days without finding him. On the third day, the monsoon caught us anyway, the way it sometimes does even to people who have spent their whole careers trying to read it. If you have never been in the desert southwest during monsoon season, I want to try to explain what that means, because it is not like rain anywhere else I have ever stood in. The storms build fast, sometimes in under an hour, towering white and then black over the mountains while the ground below is still baking in full sun. You can watch a wall of rain fall from a cloud miles away and never touch the earth, evaporating before it lands, what we call virga, and you can convince yourself the storm has nothing to do with you. Then somewhere up in that drainage, out of your sight, the rain finally does land, all at once, on ground that has been baked hard as pavement for months and cannot absorb a drop of it. And it runs. It runs downhill through every crack and channel that water has ever carved, gathering speed and mud and broken branches and boulders the size of trucks. And it arrives in the canyon below you not as a rising creek but as a wall, sometimes with wall, sometimes almost no warning at all beyond a low sound like a train that has no business being anywhere near you. That is what happened to us in Coyote Wash on the third day of the search for Caleb Whitfield. Roy and I were down in the Narrows on foot, following a game trail along the stream because it was the only flat ground for half a mile in either direction. We heard it before we saw it, that train sound, wrong and low and getting louder, and Roy grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a shelf of rock on the canyon wall, a scramble of maybe 15 feet that felt, in that moment, like it might as well have been a cliff face. I do not fully remember the climb. I remember lying flat on that rock shelf, with Roy's hand locked around my wrist, and I remember the water arriving below us not as water at all, but as a moving brown wall the height of a man, carrying a cottonwood tree end over end, like it weighed there. Nothing. We were safe. I want to say that clearly because I know how this sounds. We were safe, and we stayed up on that shelf for almost 2 hours until the flow dropped enough to consider moving, and by the time we climbed back down, the entire geography of that wash had changed. The channel had shifted almost 15 feet to the north. Boulders that had marked our search grid that morning were simply gone, or buried, or somewhere miles downstream toward the river. Caleb Whitfield's campsite was gone with them. This is the part of the story where, if I only tell you the mystery, it starts to sound like the wilderness reached out and erased the evidence on purpose. Like something wanted the scene wiped clean. I don't believe that, and I want to be honest with you about why. What happened to that campsite has a name, and geologists use it all the time. Channel avulsion. A flash flood powerful enough can pick up an entire stream and set it back down somewhere else, burying whatever was on the old channel floor under feet of new sediment in a matter of hours. It is not mysterious. It is simply violent, and it happens in desert washes with a regularity that the people who live out here respect, and the people who visit sometimes do not. Search and rescue teams lose evidence to flash floods more often than most people would guess. It is one of the ugliest, most mundane facts of working in country like this. We searched for 4 more days after the water dropped. We found nothing. No pack, no tent, no boot, no Caleb. Cadaver dogs worked the new channel and the old one and came up with nothing they could alert on with any confidence, which the handler explained could simply mean he was buried too deep under new fill for scent to reach the surface. Roy told Denise Whitfield, as gently as a man in his position can tell anyone anything, that her son had most likely been caught in that same flood or one like it before we ever arrived, and that the same water that erased our search grid had very likely erased him along with it. The case was never closed as a homicide because there was never a shred of evidence pointing toward another person. It was suspended eventually, as an unresolved missing person presumed dead by misadventure. Denise Whitfield kept his room exactly as it was for years. I know this because she told me every single time I called to tell her we had nothing new, which I did faithfully, on the anniversary, for longer than either of us probably wanted to keep doing it. That is where the story sat for 11 years. Every summer, around the anniversary of the day his checkout date passed, I would call Denise Whitfield to tell her we had nothing new, and every summer she would ask me the same handful of questions in roughly the same order, whether the search area had been reassessed, whether new equipment existed that might help, whether I still believed he was in the wilderness at all, or whether I thought secretly that he had simply walked away from his life and started a new one somewhere far from Grant County. I always told her the truth, that the physical evidence, what little there was, all pointed toward the flood and nowhere else. She kept his bedroom exactly as he'd left it for at least the first 6 of those years, she told me once, though she eventually admitted she'd had to box most of it up after a roof leak damaged part of the room, and that packing those boxes had felt like a second loss stacked on top of the first one. That is where the story sat, in other words, for 11 years. Until Sam Pruitt's boots crossed a freshly cut bank in a wash that had by pure chance decided to change its mind about where it wanted to run. I called Roy Kessler first, even though he had been retired from search and rescue for almost 6 years by then. Some habits do not retire with you. He answered on the second ring, the way he always used to during active searches, and when I had told him what Sam Pruitt had found, he was quiet long enough that I asked if he was still on the line. "I'm here," he said. "Just thinking about that cairn." I hadn't mentioned the cairn. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone in 11 years. I asked him how he knew what I was thinking about, and he told me, in that flat, unbothered voice he'd used through 100 recoveries, that he'd noticed the same thing I had in those 2 photographs, back when we were still comparing notes in the evenings during the original search, and that he'd never written it down either for exactly the same reasons I hadn't. 2 trained professionals, independently talking themselves out of the only detail that never sat right, because neither of us had a category to file it under. He said the same thing I had been thinking since I first saw Sam Pruitt's photographs, that a second flood, or a series of them over the years, must have cut back into the old buried channel from a different angle, exposing a slice of the very layer that the original flood had sealed away. Lateral erosion, cutting sideways into a paleo channel, the way a river will slowly eat into its own old floodplain. It is, again, not a mysterious process. Water moves ground, and given enough years and enough storms, it will sometimes give back exactly what it once took, in exactly the condition it left it. Denise Whitfield was the hardest call. I had made that call to her so many times over so many Julies, always with nothing, that I almost couldn't find the right words when I finally had something. She was quiet for a long time, too. And then she asked me one question, which was whether I thought it was really him. I told her the truth, that I couldn't be certain until forensics confirmed it. but that I had held that bracelet in my own hands 11 years ago while she cried in her kitchen, and I did not think I was wrong. The official recovery team could not get out to Coyote Wash for 4 more days, tied up with 2 other incidents and waiting on a helicopter that had priority elsewhere. I made the decision to hike him myself in the meantime, alone, to secure the site before another storm could undo what the last one had finally given back. This is standard practice when evidence is exposed and unstable ground threatens to bury or scatter it again. I want to be clear that this was not a hunch or compulsion. It was procedure. I have told myself that many times since, and I still believe it. The hike in took most of a day, 12 miles up from the trailhead along the Middle Fork before cutting up into Coyote Wash itself. The Gila in late summer is beautiful in a way that is easy to forget when you are only thinking about the danger of it. Ponderosa pine gives way to juniper and pinyon as you climb, and the canyon walls go every shade of rust and gray. And if you are patient and quiet, you can sometimes see the small, endangered Gila trout holding steady in the clearer pools. One of the only places left on Earth where that fish still survives in the wild. I crossed the river 4 times on that hike, boots off and pack held over my head each time, the water never higher than my waist, but cold enough in the shaded stretches to take my breath for a second, regardless. I passed the alcove where Caleb had found his fire rings without meaning to, recognized it only because his journal had described it so precisely, and I stood there a moment longer than I needed to before moving on. I have loved this wilderness my entire career. I want that on the record too, because I do not want this story to sound like a warning against the place itself. It is a warning about weather, and about what weather can do to memory as easily as it does to ground. I reached the site in the middle of the afternoon, under a sky that was still mostly clear, though I noted, the way you learn to note without even thinking about it out here, a buildup of white clouds stacking over the peaks to the northwest. I gave myself, by my own estimate, a comfortable 4 hours before I needed to be thinking seriously about weather. The bank Sam Prout had photographed had slumped further since his visit, exposing more of the old layer. I found the rest of Caleb's boot within the first 20 minutes, along with fragments of what forensics would later confirm were human remains, which I will not describe in detail here out of respect for his family, except to say that they were consistent with a sudden violent death and not with prolonged exposure or starvation. Whatever happened to Caleb Whitfield happened fast. What I was not expecting to find, wedged under a shelf of rock a few feet above the exposed layer, protected from the worst of 11 years of weather, was a sealed dry bag, the kind backpackers use to waterproof gear for river crossings. Inside it, still legible, was Caleb's field journal. I sat down on a boulder in the shade and I read it, because I did not trust myself to wait for a lab in a city 3 hours away to hand it back to me in a plastic sleeve months later. I understand now that this was probably not correct procedure. I have made my peace with that. Most of the journal was exactly what you would expect from a folklore graduate student on a research trip. Interview notes from ranching families, sketches of a cattle brand, a long and genuinely interesting page about the history of the wilderness. Designation itself, the kind of page a person writes when they are enjoying their own work. There was an entry from his first night in Coyote Wash that was almost cheerful, describing the hike-in. A bighorn sheep he'd spotted high on the canyon rim. A joke to himself about how his advisor would react if he came home with nothing but ghost stories and no actual data. Reading that entry sitting on that boulder, in the heat, with his remains not 30 feet away from me, was harder than almost anything else that day. But the last 5 entries, written over what must have been his final 2 days, read differently from everything before them. He wrote that he'd found the fire rings first, low charcoal smudges in a rock alcove that could have been decades or centuries old. No way to date them without lab equipment he didn't have. He wrote that finding the carved marks nearby, cut shallow into a face of pale rock, had made him laugh out loud alone in the canyon, from sheer relief that Warren Boyle's story had at least this much basis in something real on the ground. He wrote that he had found the fire rings and the carved marks Warren Boyle's story described, low on a rock face near his camp. Worn but deliberate, though he couldn't say how old they were or who had made them, and that finding them had made the whole trip feel worth it. He wrote that first night, he had been woken by what he assumed was an animal moving stone somewhere near his tent, and that in the morning, he had found the small cairn he'd built the day before, for no real reason except habit, with one of its top stones turned to face a different direction than he remembered leaving it. He wrote, the second night, that he heard his own name called from down the wash, twice, in a voice pitched low enough that he told himself it was the wind moving through the narrows, which does happen out here, the canyon walls playing tricks with ash. Sound the way a seashell plays tricks with your ear. He wrote that he almost didn't get up to check. He wrote that he was glad afterward that he did, because he thought he saw, just for a moment, at the very edge of where his headlamp beam gave out, a shape standing at roughly his own height, in roughly his own height, in roughly his own posture, that turned and was gone into the dark before he could be sure he'd seen anything at all. His final entry, time-stamped the following morning, said that the sky did not look right for that early in the day, that it had the color he associated with an afternoon storm building hours ahead of schedule, and that he had decided, out of caution, to break camp and move his tent up onto higher ground above the wash before doing any more work that day. That is where the journal ends. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it on that boulder, because it is the one piece of this story I have never been able to fold into a tidy shape. His remains were recovered down in the wash, at the level of the old channel floor, not up on the higher ground he wrote about moving to. Either he changed his mind and went back down for something, his stove, his water filter, some piece of gear he could not bear to abandon, which is a very human and very explainable thing to do. Or something else happened between the last word he wrote and the moment the water found him, something that got him back down into that channel before it broke. I do not know which. I have never been able to know which. I have decided, in the years since, that I am at peace with not knowing, though I will admit to you that peace took a long time to arrive at, and some days it still hasn't fully. I did not get much more time to think about it that afternoon, because the sky finished the job it had started building hours earlier. I want to walk you through this part carefully, the way I have had to walk myself through it more than once since, because I think the ordinary facts of it matter as much as anything strange about it. I had radio contact that day with our dispatcher, a woman named Lucy Fenwick, who was tracking my location and doing routine check-ins every hour, standard procedure for a solo field assignment. My last check-in with Lucy had been roughly 40 minutes before I heard the first low rumble come off the peaks to the northwest, a sound I have heard often enough in this job that my body reacted to it before my mind had finished deciding it was real. Dual mortar. I was up and moving within a minute, packing the journal and the dry bag, radioing Lucy to report the storm and my intention to move to higher ground immediately. What I remember most clearly is how fast the light changed, the way it does out here. Full afternoon sun going the color of an old bruise in what felt like 10 minutes, and the way the air went suddenly, sharply cold and smelled like a struck match. Exactly the way Caleb Whitfield had described it in his own journal not an hour before. I climbed. I want to be honest that I climbed faster and less carefully than I have trained anyone else to ever climb in that terrain, scrambling up loose scree toward a rock shelf I had identified as my exit route the moment I arrived at the site that morning. The same kind of habit that had saved my life once already in this exact canyon, 11 years earlier, with Roy Kessler's hand around my wrist. I heard the water before I reached the shelf. That same low train sound, wrong in building, and underneath it, or threaded through it, or possibly only inside my own head in a moment of genuine terror I heard my name. Teresa, I want to give you the honest, boring explanation first, because I believe it mostly. Lucy Fenwick was actively radioing me at that exact moment, urgently, trying to confirm I had reached safety. And it is entirely possible, likely even, that what I heard was her voice coming through my radio, distorted by wind and by the roar of Thial. Water and by my own racing pulse, twisted into something that only sounded, for one disorienting half-second, like it was coming from the canyon floor behind me instead of the speaker clipped to my shoulder. Canyon acoustics do strange things to sound. I have heard rangers swear they heard voices in wind-scoured narrows for 31 years, and every single time, when we've been able to run it down, there has been a radio, or an echo, or another hiker, somewhere out of sight around a bend. I did not stop to look behind me. My legs found the last stretch of scree almost on their own. The way muscle memory takes over completely when a body decides thinking has become a luxury it can no longer afford, and I made the shelf with what I would guess was less than a minute to spare. I pressed myself flat against the rock, the same way Roy had taught me without ever meaning to teach me anything, just by living long enough to do it first, and I watched, from a ledge that felt entirely too much like the one I had huddled on more. Then a decade before, as the flood arrived. It came the way it always comes, which is to say all at once and completely without mercy for the ground it used to be. A brown wall taller than I was, carrying a juniper trunk end over end the way the cottonwood had been carried 11 years earlier. And underneath the roar of it I could hear boulders grinding against each other somewhere down in the churn. A sound, like the canyon itself grinding its teeth. It swallowed the exposed bank in less time than it takes to say so. It swallowed the spot where I had been sitting with Caleb Whitfield's journal open on my knee less than 20 minutes earlier. The dry bag, the boot, all of it gone under brown water in a matter of seconds. As if the wash had simply changed its mind. Again about what it was willing to give back. When I checked my radio log afterward, back at the district office, Lucy's transmission calling my name was time-stamped at 4 minutes before I recalled hearing it. 4 minutes is not nothing over open radio during a storm, but it is also not an unreasonable gap, given signal bounce in canyon country and the general unreliability of timestamps during an emergency broadcast. I have chosen to believe it was Lucy. Most days I do believe it was Lucy. I am telling you the timestamp anyway, because I think you deserve the same honest, incomplete picture I have had to live with. The recovery team reached the site 5 days later, once the water had dropped and the ground had stabilized enough to work safely. I went back out with them, partly out of duty and partly because I did not think I could stand hearing about it secondhand. The bank the flood had exposed was gone again, cut a different way now. But a forensic anthropologist working with the team was able to locate the layer using photographs Sam Prout and I had both taken, and over the better part of a long, hot day, they recovered what the wash had been holding on to for 11 years. It was quieter work than I expected. Nobody talked much. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, one of the technicians found the boot's mate a few feet further down the old channel, and I remember how strange it felt to see the two of them reunited on a plastic sheet after a decade apart, buried on opposite sides of a boundary neither of them had chosen to cross. They confirmed what the exposed remains had already told me. Caleb Whitfield, formally identified through dental records, cause of death consistent with drowning and blunt trauma, entirely consistent with a flash flood. No indication of another person's involvement, then, or ever. The medical examiner closed the case, 11 years late, as an accidental death. I drove out to see Denise Whitfield myself rather than call her, because I felt she had earned better than a phone call after everything else I had ever given her over the phone. I brought the bracelet, cleaned and returned by the lab, and I brought a photocopy of the journal, the original having gone into evidence and eventually, I understand, back to her as well. I did not tell her about the missing 30 minutes between his last entry and where his body was found. I did not tell her about the stone that turned, or about the shape at the edge of a headlamp beam, or about the sound I may or may not have heard over the roar of a flood 11 years and one day after the first one nearly took me too. I told her the parts that were true and useful and kind, that her son had been found, that he had not suffered a slow death, that the wilderness he loved enough to study had finally, after all this time, given him back. She held onto that bracelet the way I imagine I would hold onto anything that had traveled that far to get back to me, turning it over once in her palm before closing her fingers around it, the same way I remembered her holding it 11 years earlier, under entirely different circumstances. She told me she was planning a small service, family only, and asked if I would come, and I told her I would. And I did, a few weeks later, standing at the back of a modest room in Silver City while people who had loved Caleb Whitfield said kind, true things about who he had been before any of this happened to him. She asked me, at her door, before I left that first day, whether I thought he had been afraid at the end. I told her I didn't know. That was the truth. It is still the truth. I am close to retirement now, closer than I like to think about most days, and Coyote Wash is not a place I patrol often anymore, though I could walk it blind if I had to. Roy still calls me every summer around the anniversary, the way I used to call Denise, just to check that I'm still doing all right with it, which I think is his way of admitting he never quite finished doing all right with it himself. When I do go out that way, usually to check trail conditions before monsoon season opens up in earnest, I still find myself watching the clouds build over the Mogollon Mountains a little more carefully than the job strictly requires, and I still find myself, more often than I would ever admit to anyone at the district office, glancing back over my shoulder at the exact spot on that canyon wall, where a rock shelf saved my life twice, 31 years and 11 years apart, to make sure nothing years apart, to make sure nothing behind me is standing where it shouldn't be. I keep a copy of that photocopied journal in my own desk now. Not the original, which went back to Denise Whitfield where it belonged, but a copy I made before I handed it over, which I am not entirely sure was allowed, and which I have never sure was allowed, and which I have never regretted. I don't read it often, but I know exactly which page it falls open to when I do, the same way I know exactly which stretch of that wash I still walk a little faster through than the terrain requires. The wash runs clean and quiet most of the year. It is only ahead of the water, in that narrow gap between the first cold gust and the first drop of rain, that I still catch myself listening for something that has no business being there. I tell myself every single time that it's only ever been the wind, or a radio, or a canyon doing what canyons do to sound. Every single time so far, I have been right. I intend to keep it that way for as long as this job is mine to do.